Okay, I think we're good. We've got people trickling in. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Suzette Malveaux, the director of the Byron White Center for the Study of American Constitutional Law at the University of Colorado. Welcome to the 29th Annual Rothgerber Conference. It's great to have you here this morning. I want to start by acknowledging I'm here in Colorado and that we are meeting on the lands of the Shiyan, Arapaho, and Ute nations. I'd like to take this moment to pay respect to the elders, past, present, and future, who lead these communities. I'd like to start by thanking my colleague, Professor Ming Hsu Chen, whose book, Pursuing Citizenship in the Enforcement Era, was the brainchild of the conference this year. What an incredibly timely and important issue to be taking on right now. Thank you for your hard work. Thank you for setting the stage for this important conversation that we are going to be having today with so many people, with immigrants, lawyers, students, community organizers, scholars from all over the country, and from all kinds of disciplines, from history, sociology, ethnic studies, political science, and the law. There's so much I really appreciate about Professor Chen's book. I'll just name a few. One is the emphasis on the importance of belonging. Another is how she unmasks how enforcement policies have harmed immigrant integration across the spectrum of status. Another is the exploration of immigrant experience from a full range, whether it's green card holders, refugees, veterans, DACA recipients, highly skilled workers, or international students. Just really a bottom-up approach. And ultimately, her reliance on stories, the firsthand accounts of the people themselves, over 100 interviews with immigrants. And it reminds me of last night. We started our conference off with Modus Theater, and we had the pleasure and honor of hearing our immigrant neighbors tell their stories firsthand through undocumented monologues. And with a guest speaker, Judge Mimi Sankoff, who's an immigration judge, literally put herself in the shoes of another person to try to understand their experience. It was a really powerful and beautiful moment. So we're going to continue with that kind of foundation. I think this is the right place to have this conversation. As I mentioned, I'm here in the state of Colorado. It's a state that really runs the gamut when it comes to views about immigration policies. So we don't all think the same way and see things the same way. The state of Colorado, I would add, 10% of our population is comprised of immigrants. And of that population, 37%, about 200,000 people, are undocumented. More than 15,000 DACA recipients live in the state of Colorado. Not only is it an important place to have this conversation, but an important time to be thinking about citizenship, immigration, and belonging. It's a painful time. So, for example, there's been an increase in anti-Asian American hate crimes by almost 150% this past year. But it's also a hopeful time. There's a new administration which is attempting to balance enforcement with pathways to citizenship and a more humane treatment of immigrants. So I really look forward to a day of learning and growth and listening and new ideas in terms of what we can think about with Professor Chen's book and the ideas that she raises in that book. Let me turn my attention to the logistics of the day, what you can expect, sort of what our strategy or procedures will be. And many of those details will be posted for you in the chat. First of all, the outline of the day, we have a program, a digital program that is available for you that will be posted in the chat. You can find that at cu.law/Rothgerber program. As I mentioned, Modus Theater is amazing. We were so grateful last night to have joined them for Undocumented Monologues, stories of our undocumented neighbors. They did a wonderful job with our guest, Judge Mimi Sankoff of the National Association of Immigration Judges. If you want to learn more about the excellent work that the Modus Theater is doing, there's also a link in the chat that you can go to. So I encourage you to do that. Between each of the panels, we're going to have a 15-minute break. So during that 15-minute break, you will see a slide that will give you information about what's coming up next. That break, people are welcome to stretch, eat, do whatever you need to do before you come back. For those of you, my audience members who are using the webinar, you will be able to ask questions through the Q&A function. So that will be available throughout the day. We won't be doing that for a very opening session, but you're welcome to ask questions later. For those of you who are on YouTube live stream, unfortunately, you won't be able to ask questions, but we're really excited to have you here. Anybody can join us at the end of the day. We're going to be doing something a little different. We're trying a virtual reception. And so we will have breakout rooms that will give you an opportunity to join a link that will again be posted in the chat. It's going to be cu.law/Rothgerber reception. And that's where we'll, think of it kind of, it's an informal chat. You'll get a chance to connect with people, maybe go do a deeper dive on a topic that we've covered, or think about you've been sitting all day, hearing a day of talking, and maybe you'll want to figure out how do I take that and put it into action. So you'll be hearing people who actually are boots on the ground, who are doing good work that you might want to participate in. So we welcome that. We hope you'll stay with us. That will be posted in the chat. For my lawyers out there, the conference is, let me remind you, it's worth 6 general CLE credits. So we will be reaching out to you next week for those who do attend, and through the webinar to get you the affidavit that you're going to need. This is a full day from 9 to 5 of programming. So you are completely welcome to sort of pop in and pop out as it works for your schedule. Not a problem. Just go ahead and rejoin using the same link that you used to join us to begin with. If it turns out for any reason that you are not able to join, then by all means, just jump on that YouTube live stream link, cu.law/live. And that's also hopefully available in the chat. We can make that there for you. Again, if you've got friends who didn't have a chance to register, didn't get the time, they're welcome to join us today by going to that YouTube live stream, the cu.law/live link. All right. So those are all the logistics. If you have questions, pop them in the chat. We'll see if we can get them answered for you. So I'd like to turn our attention to the program today itself and say that there is no dearth of issues which Professor Chen's book does not touch. And you will hear many of them today discussed by some of the most important thought leaders in this area. And I'd like now at this time to introduce two of those thought leaders to you. Professor Ming Hsu Chen, I'll start with you. First of all, this is my friend and my colleague. Ming Hsu Chen is an associate professor at the University of Colorado Law School here in Boulder. She's the faculty director of the Immigration and Citizenship Law program. She holds faculty affiliations with political science and ethnic studies as well. And she brings an interesting and dynamic interdisciplinary perspective to the study of immigration, civil rights, and the administrative state. She sits on the Colorado Advisory Council of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. She's the co-editor of the Immigration Prof blog, and she can also be found on Twitter. She has done a variety of media all over the country. Her book, Pursuing Citizenship in the Enforcement Era, published by Stanford University Press last year and was featured in the TEDx Mile High in December of 2020. So I'm so grateful that you're here and you're going to be sharing your work and your ideas and have been such an inspiration for all of us. I'd like to also introduce Hiroshi Motomura. Professor Motomura is the Susan Westerberg Prager Distinguished Professor of Law at UCLA Law School. He is the faculty director there of their new Center for Immigration Law and Policy. We were lucky to have him at University of Colorado before he jumped to UCLA. He's also taught at UNC Chapel Hill, and he has won various teaching awards. He's one of 26 law professors who's named in the book, What the Best Law Teachers Do. He's a founding director of the Rocky Mountain Immigrant Advocacy Network. He was a director of the National Immigration Law Center from 2011 to 2020. So we're really honored to have the two of them in conversation together. So what we're going to do right now, we won't have a Q&A portion for this, but we get to be a fly on the wall, and we get to just watch them in conversation about their work and about Professor Chen's book and what we can expect for the rest of the day. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to my colleagues to take it from here.
Thank you so much, Suzette, for that warm welcome and wonderful introduction to the day. I feel like you really set a vision for this conference, which we've been talking about for more than a year. And I also want to thank the planning committee who have helped to implement that vision. John Griffin, Seema Sohi, David Cook-Martin, Hunter Knapp, Doug Spencer, Melissa Shunter, all of you have made this day possible. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be able to share this book, but also for this opportunity to be able to shine light on the issue of citizenship, which I don't think we talk about enough. And I will hope we talk about more in the coming years. The book launched on Citizenship Day last year. And I'm thinking of today as kind of a landing among many of the people who I hope will find this book helpful. That would include scholars who will be here, a lot of my friends inside and outside of the academy. Some of the immigrants I interviewed in the book will be here today as well. And foremost among all of those people, Hiroshi Motomura, who has guided me through my career, helped me shape a lot of these ideas, and read the book before there was a book. He read the book proposal, he read the book manuscript, and it's really a pleasure to be able to talk with him about the finished result. So thank you, Hiroshi, for being here and being such an influence on the book.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you. Good morning and good afternoon or good evening to everyone here, wherever you may be. I'm just thank you for inviting me. I'm especially honored to be part of the event. I was, as Suzette mentioned, I was on the Colorado faculty for actually quite a number of years. And I think it's fair to say, no matter when I hang up the spikes, it will have been for most of my career. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be in this conversation. And also, Ming, I want to say, congratulations on the book. That's just 4 words, but I mean, it really, I know it's been a long but satisfying journey, and a journey in which I think anyone who works on a project this long grows a lot during that process and learns a lot. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be able to talk about this book. It's a fabulous book, and it touches on, as Suzette mentioned, so many different issues, and it's in so many ways it's a perfect framing for this conference. So I think that it's great that this conference doesn't start with a traditional keynote speech, but really with this conversation, because this really is, the book is a perfect way to introduce the day, but also to frame it. And I'm hoping that, in the 45 minutes or so that we have, it's an opportunity to not just, I mean, of course we want to hear about your book. I'm going to ask you some questions about the book and give you a chance to share with the audience who may not have had a chance to read it yet. But in addition to hearing about the book, I think there's a chance to identify the themes and questions that we should keep in mind throughout the day. There'll be many conversations we'll be having. They all touch in some way on citizenship, but I think from a more granular perspective, they touch upon citizenship in ways that your book suggests, introduces, instigates. So I'm going to start then with just to ask you to talk about some things that I noticed about the book start with some fundamental things and maybe get to some things that are a little bit more fine-tuned. But I also wanted to say, just as a moment of just kind of to be transparent about this, is I also really want to use this as a way to set up the panels and to kind of think about the things that we might want to keep in mind, and really the questions that your book leaves open or raises without necessarily addressing. So, I mean, here's a question which is basic, but I think it's just really important to think about in terms of the book. Many people who identify themselves as immigration scholars, citizenship scholars, people who think about these matters of who's let in, who's not let in, who's allowed to stay, who's kicked out. Many folks like that, and I suppose I would count myself in that group, write about immigration. They write about immigration law. That's how they'll talk about themselves. But and their writing often is not centered on citizenship. And so it's a very general question, but what led you to focus on citizenship in this project, to frame it that way? And what do you think that focusing on citizenship allows you to address that maybe you might not be able to say if this were called immigration law in an enforcement era?
Well, I think that the subject of citizenship does it falls through the cracks of conversations about immigration law and conversations about belonging and membership that are often focused more on race and other subjects. And I see citizenship as the connective thread between those two areas. And some of the way that I know that is I'm the child of two naturalized immigrants to the United States. And through the years of learning the scholarship and writing in the scholarship, I don't always see my family in that scholarship as people who are immigrants, were immigrants, and are citizens. So some of it is that I wanted to be able to put that experience at the center of the book. And I wanted to do it in a way that focused on the immigrants' experience of navigating American life. And that is why the book is interview-based to a large extent. It's really a law and society book. It's about the law, but it's mostly about how everyday people experience the law.
Yeah, I mean, I want to ask you about those interviews, but I'm going to hold off on that a little bit because what you just said about citizenship just now, I mean, I really understand that. I mean, I suppose that influences a lot of the way I think about my own work. Even when people write about immigration law, they often have larger issues of membership and belonging in mind. So I totally get what you're saying. It makes sense to me. But another thing, though, and I think this is really one of the big arguments of your book, is that the word citizenship, even though it appears, front and center in your title, I think you do a lot to explain why that word is inadequate, or at least incomplete. It means different things to different people in different settings. And so sometimes it feels like almost like a Rorschach blot type of thing where you use the word citizenship and it can mean so many different things. And there are a lot of different ways that you use it and unpack it that I wanted to ask you about. But, in the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on a few of them and ask you to maybe pick the one you want to, or ones you want to deal with. But let me just mention two of them. I mean, one is you talk about substantive citizenship and you talk about formal citizenship. And that seems like is a very important sort of thing. And let me give you another one here, even though this question I realize is starting to get very complicated. You also, in addition to talking about substantive citizenship and formal citizenship, you talk about defensive citizenship. And so those are three very basic things. And I want to ask you to talk about them, especially because my sense is that they help set up a lot of the conversations during the day.
Sure. You're right to note that the way I talk about citizenship it goes beyond the way that I think legal scholars in particular usually talk about citizenship. You and I both teach immigration and citizenship law at our respective law schools. And I think a lot of that conversation tends to be about formal citizenship, right? It is the black letter law of immigration. It is what the meaning of the statute is, what the foundational cases are. And I think that is important to understand, because if you understand the formal law of citizenship, right off the bat, you understand that citizenship is not a binary, that we have many different categories of immigrants and that people move among those categories. So formal law is part of the book, But as you mentioned, and that is a lot of what panel one is going to be about, is thinking about citizenship theory, but also thinking about what goes beyond the law. And that's where this idea of substantive citizenship comes up. And I'm not the first to think about that idea. It's actually a very sociological idea, in thinking about not only the legal and rights-based definition of citizenship, but also what it means to be economically integrated into the United States, what it means to be socially integrated, what it means to have a voice, even if not through the specific form of voting. And that sociological piece, I think, comes, foundationally from people like Mary Waters, Tomas Hernandez, who's going to be on panel 2 today. But that is also something that I try to bring into the very basic definition of citizenship that I'm using through the rest of the book.
And, but what about defensive citizenship? This is, I'm not suggesting, I don't think you set this up in such a way that there's substantive versus formal citizenship versus defensive. These are operating on different axes, but I think it's an important idea that you develop in the book. And I think you developed that very nicely through the interview process. And I think it'd be worth hearing a little bit more about that, defensive citizenship.
Sure. So the idea of defensive citizenship might sound like a paradox. Even today, we've already been talking about citizenship most as membership and belonging and inclusion. But I do think the reality is you talk to immigrants about their experience, especially in the last several years. It is an experience that is not just about inclusion, it's also about exclusion. And a lot of the immigrants that I met with spoke about their desire to get citizenship, not just because of the American flag and the patriotism and the ideals of freedom, but also because they felt like they needed protection from a lot of the very extreme enforcement measures that have been brewing for the last 30, 40 years. And so in the essence, that's what I mean by defensive citizenship, is realizing that it becomes both a sword and a shield. To be able to protect people from an enforcement environment, but also a way for them to find a way in to American society that they otherwise might not have if they weren't able to flip that switch and move closer to formal citizenship.
And just as a follow-up then, that a lot of what you're calling defensive citizenship is the acquisition of formal citizenship. Is that the right way to understand that?
Well, I think the core interviews in the book are talking with green card holders who have the ability to access formal citizenship. And even that category, as you well know, includes a lot of different kinds of immigrants, right? It includes people who have family sponsors, employment-based sponsors, refugees, veterans, and they're all in the book because they have that path, but the path is different for each of them. But the other group of interviews that are in this book, and this is really what third panel focuses on, is those who don't have that path. And so for those, it is partly what it means to them to be a non-citizen and to not be able to access that formal citizenship and yet to still be needing to carve out a life for themselves in every other dimension. So I think that is, that's how I see the relationship between the formal and the substantive. And, to tip my hand a little bit on the findings, of course, there's not one story that comes out of 100 interviews. But I do think, I would say that the relationship between formal and substantive citizenship is, that formal citizenship is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And that's certainly true for those who don't have to formal citizenship. But I think it even ends up being true for those who become citizens, for naturalized citizens, that they too find that they fall short of full citizenship, because of race, because of language, because of familiarity and access to social networks. And so in that sense, it's the interaction of formal and substantive that I found really interesting when I talk to people about their very complex lives.
And some people who are non-citizens, I think you illustrate quite nicely in the book, some people who are not formal citizens don't feel the need for the defensive citizenship as much as other people. And it may be by race or accent or any number of or class or any number of things like that. Yeah, that's a big theme that, again, I want to get to your interviews in a few minutes, but I I don't know if apologies appropriate, but I really feel like I'm just sort of interrogating you about the title of your book. But I think that's actually a sign of a great title because, someone once told me that the best titles are the ones that have the entire argument in the title. Often a good book talk is really about your choice of the words and really thinking about what goes into the title. So let me ask you, I just want to ask you one more question about your title, because it's really about the project. It's about a book. It's about, implicates why you wrote it. You could have called this book Membership in an enforcement era. You could have called it Belonging. Why citizenship? Especially because citizenship is such a word, as we'll find out today, it means so many different things to so many different people. But you could have called it membership or belonging in an enforcement era, and you didn't. And I'm just curious what went into that kind of choice.
I think that the words membership and belonging are very broad, but I actually think citizenship is more all-encompassing. Because I think about membership, I think foremost about social belonging, social citizenship, right? That goes back to T.H. Marshall. I mean, a book that many citizenship scholars will read, that was written in the earlier part of the century. But I think that what citizenship also highlights is the connection between membership and belonging and the boundaries of a nation state. There's a reason that we learn about citizenship, not just as immigration scholars, but in high school civics. This might be some of my political science background influencing the way I think about citizenship. But I do think it connects the idea of membership and belonging for immigrants with this ideal of what America looks like as a country and what it stands for, and the tensions between being someone who is not fully legally and politically recognized, and yet is trying to live in a world that is bounded. I think Linda Bosniak talks a little bit about bringing the borders inside. I think that's the classic experience we're talking about, particularly when we're talking about naturalized citizens, but for any category of immigrants who are trying to make their life inside a country that has boundaries and ideals of membership and belonging.
No, that's great. That makes a lot of sense to me, and maybe this is why a lot of us, even at this conference, gravitate toward something that is about quote citizenship end quote. I just want to ask. I'd like to now move to the second half of your title, just for one question. What do you mean by the enforcement era? When did it start? How do you know if it ever ends? Your book in the title, but also every argument in your book. And every piece of the analysis seems to suggest that we're in an era and that it's defined by enforcement and that heavily influences the way we think about citizenship, right? As a way of thinking about belonging or membership in some sense. But what do we mean by the enforcement era? When does it start? Does it ever end?
I think in terms of when it starts, a lot of people would assume that the enforcement era began with the election of Donald Trump, and that it ended with the election of Joe Biden. And I do think there's a piece of this book that is timely and that tries to speak about the way those ideas show themselves in the policies of the last several years and the ways that they've affected the lives of immigrants during this moment. But I do think that the timeline extends in both directions. If I were to look at where I think the enforcement era begins, I would say, I think the last major immigration reform we had was in 1954, and we've essentially been tweaking that formula since then. In particular, I think, the major immigration reforms, 1986, IRCA, which, put in place a lot of employment-based sanctions, 1996, where we talked about public welfare, post 9/11, where we talk about terrorism. And then more recently, I would say this is after the book came out, but COVID-19. I mean, these are all key moments that have launched enforcement policies. And so I think it's important to recognize that, yes, I am talking about the last administration, but I'm talking about the last administration as maybe a high watermark of something that's been building for about 50 years. Now, in terms of where it ends, that's a great question, and I would like to know that too. I do feel, I share some of the hopefulness that Suzette mentioned in her introduction, that, I didn't know there was going to be a major piece of legislation introduced called the Citizenship Act of 2021. I do hope that that signals that there are opportunities to start to change the narrative. But that said, the ways that we've been talking about it, enforcement is also just baked into the design of having a nation state. So in that sense, I think the enforcement era is not time bound. There is always going to be this aspect of insiders and outsiders, especially when we are talking about an institution that has formal dimensions that are very consequential for people's lives.
Yeah, it makes me realize, it's not only the different moments and different things that you talk about historically, that different interventions in the enforcement space and intensified or at least amplified enforcement, but it can operate differently with different people. I remember, my mother was a permanent resident for over 30 years, actually, and decided, I think in some defensive sense, to get naturalized in the 1990s. And I think some of that had to do with the 1996 Act and what that suggested about the future. And so that really matters. It's also interesting that that the Citizenship Act that President Biden is advocating for in Congress is called the Citizenship Act, because it could have been called the Legalization Act, but it is called the Citizenship Act. And not just because he knew about our conference here today, but it's an interesting framing, right? Because it shows really what this is about in terms of that legislation. The key aspect is the path to citizenship. So let me move past the title of the book and just ask you about the first page. One of the things I really enjoy about the book, especially as someone who generally does not do empirical work, unless archival work is empirical work, I suppose it is. But you start the book with a citizenship workshop, and for many of us who don't do what legal academics call interdisciplinary work, you start with interviews, and I'd appreciate your sharing how you chose the scenes and the interviews that you highlighted. Is there a scene or two that didn't make it into a book you'd like to tell us about? Or more generally, I'm just curious how you interwove the empirical interview dimension of the book with rigorous legal analysis.
Yeah, so there's a very techie answer to this, and then also one that might be of interest to a broader audience. I'll quickly throw out the techie one for, in particular, the social scientists who might be watching today. This was a book that involved pretty structured interviews. So I didn't randomly select 100 interviews, 100 people to interview. What I did is that I started with what I know about the immigrant experience. I knew that from my point of view, there were at least 6 legal categories that were important. The 3 that we mentioned that relate to having some kind of permanent status and a path to citizenship. And then the experience of non-citizens, which of course can also be subdivided into those with temporary visas, like international students. So here in Boulder, we have a lot of H-1B high-tech workers who are software engineers for Google and other places. And then, of course, those who are undocumented, including a very active group of DACA students that are here on this campus. So I started with that idea that the immigrant experience is woven through by these legal categories. And I set to interview within those groups. And it's qualitative work through and through. But the way that I went about processing it in some ways was very systematic. I coded my interviews. I ran them through Atlas TI. I looked for themes that came out of the interviews in that way. Mostly I was looking for the stories, but I also wanted to have a sense of how the stories illuminated broader trends in my data. So that might be a very sterile way of talking about what I did, but I guess it's to say that every scene and every quote is uttered by one person, but there are at least 5 or 10 more people who would have said something similar. And I probably just picked the one that was most memorable to me, or was put the most eloquently, but the ones that represented those ideas.
So, one follow-up, and this is admittedly a very naive question, and it's one that social scientists work with all the time. But maybe many of us, involved in the conference today, don't confront this, at least not professionally. How did you put people at ease? How did you get them to talk to you? And how did you make up? Well, you must have guessed you were missing from people who didn't want to talk. I think about people in my own family and relatives, and if someone interviewed them about why they became first of all, how they got their green cards, but also, why they naturalized and that sort of thing, they might have been reluctant to talk or kind of go the other way, so that you wouldn't catch them and be able to ask them the question. I mean, how did you work with that?
So I think in terms of building trust and finding immigrants and convincing them that among the many different things they needed to do in the day, that they might want to spend an hour talking with me and my research team. I think it was actually pretty important that it was a research team and that it wasn't just me. Mm-hmm. I worked over the course of this project. There were probably somewhere between 6 or 10 law students who served as research assistants. And each of them brought an area of access that I might not have had myself. So as one example, Travis Weiner was a student who graduated at this point, maybe 3 or 4 years ago from CU Law School. And he served in Iraq before he came to the law school. So he was the one who interviewed, and in some cases located, the service members who were interviewed. I think they were much happier and more open talking with Travis than they were with me. When we talked with the international students, I had a student who was previously an international student, who was already an insider to that community. I think this was especially important with the refugees and with undocumented immigrants who were very vulnerable during the period that we were writing this book. And so again, that's where I tapped research assistants and some colleagues in Colorado, but I think especially the research assistants who worked on this, because not only do they share something in common with the interviewees, talking with young people is just much more disarming than talking with, a professor who has a business card and sits in, the Ivy League. So these are just students who wanted to know about them and who wanted to be helpful. A lot of the people we interviewed, we met at citizenship workshops where we were there to help them with their process of navigating citizenship, or at DACA renewal workshops. International student convenings over the many, many different policies that came out that people wanted to understand. So I think in that sense, knowing that we were interested and interested from the standpoint of wanting to be helpful, I think was really, was important. In terms of who's not in the book, that's one that I really wrestled with. As you know, having written a few books yourself, at some point you have to decide that it's enough, even though it's actually not. And some of the people that I really wish could be in this book, if I could have kept working on it for another 5 years, were those who were at the ends of the citizenship spectrum. So, I feel like I try to open up that idea of citizenship to a large extent, maybe to a larger extent than some other people already do, by including not only undocumented immigrants and green card holders, but also including people on temporary visas. So I try to do that, but who's not in the book? I don't actually have naturalized citizens in the book. I only interview people until they're about to become citizens or thinking about it. And I do think that's really important. Amanda Frost is going to talk later in the panel about denaturalization. And I think that suggests that some of the story of citizenship insecurity and falling short of full citizenship extends beyond the immigrants, right? And then on the other end of the spectrum, of the undocumented immigrants, I only interviewed and quoted people with the protection of DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. So there are a lot of undocumented immigrants who are not eligible for DACA, either because they just don't meet the requirements. They were too old when the program came up. They didn't come in at the right moment in history. Or they might have, a criminal conviction in their past that makes them ineligible. And that's a really important group, and they're not in the book. So, some of that was just, an issue of resources and needing to finish. But some of that also was driven by choices about wanting to be able to focus on the place where people should have the best chance of becoming citizens, and yet we're still having a hard time.
One other piece of this, which is a geographical piece. I don't know what there is to really say about that, but one thing that I think is noticeable about any research of this type is that it's people associate or people think about citizenship and immigration issues very differently in different parts of the country, both at a cultural level, but also in terms of their own personal situations. And so I don't know if it gave you pause, if the geography of where you're doing this work gave you pause, or in fact you came away with confidence that this is fairly representative, or at least that it draws lessons or yields lessons that apply at least throughout the United States. And then perhaps one thing I'm thinking of is that many of these issues are replicated around the world in various different contexts.
Yeah. I think the challenge of doing interviews as opposed to large end surveys, where you can interview not 100 people, but 1,000 people, or even more than 1,000 people, is that it is difficult to be representative. That is a term of art as well as a common term, which is to say, if these ideas would hold true if I was doing these interviews in one of the other 49 states in the country. Mm-hmm. And so, that is a challenge of doing this kind of qualitative work. But I also think it's just an inherent challenge in talking about immigration, because it is such a varied experience. So you're never going to find one perfect example or one representative example. So what I instead tried to do is, by focusing on Colorado, to be really aware of what the features are of focusing on Colorado and how that might be different elsewhere. So, Colorado on immigration, I think, is pretty moderate. There have been moments where it's quite progressive. I think our refugee integration programs have been really strong in ways that, those of us who live here might not even know. But on the other hand, it tends not to be the most extreme either. It's not the one that's on the front page, with Sheriff Joe or Pio, or, Arizona. It's not a border city. And so in that sense, I don't think it's representative. But I think it is somewhere in the middle. And again, if the experience is to focus on the everyday experience of relatively ordinary immigrants, I think finding a place that's moderate is actually a pretty good way to do that.
Yeah, that's the impression I got. Not just from living a lot of my life in Colorado and staying in close touch, but also in understanding the politics of the state over the years. And in some sense, I think this is a book with greater national resonance and audience than a book that might have been written that's centered with interviews in Los Angeles, for example, as purporting to be representative of what's happening in the country. Although of course Los Angeles is representative, and maybe every geographical location is useful and helpful and yields lessons in its own way. Let's do this because I've already asked you about some of the major themes in the book about what citizenship is, why use that word, different forms of citizenship, formal, substantive, defensive, and there are many other things that we'll be exploring today. And I asked you about the enforcement frames frames the entire inquiry. So I'm going to skip ahead to the last chapter. If I don't know if it's fair or not, but it's also a concession of time. But I think this is something that yields some questions that carry through the day, and also touch on some contemporary political issues. All this touches on contemporary political issues. But you start the last chapter by talking about the medics. METICS in ancient Greece. And could you say more? I think that's a very useful way to think about some of the issues that are inherent in both citizenship and immigration law and policy. Could you say more about the medics, why you talk about them, why you start the last chapter with them, and what they tell us about the struggles that we have in this country right now about how to deal with belonging?
So the medics, as you mentioned, are from ancient Greece, right? Sort of from the time of Aristotle. And I not only conclude the book, I start my class on citizenship by talking about the medics, because I think that, the experience of the medics in ancient Greece is that they were an important part of society. So in the sense that Aristotle always talked about civic engagement as being the crux of citizenship rather than more of a Roman legal formal status, the medics had a very unique and sometimes troubling experience because they were not only non-citizens, they were essentially undocumented immigrants in today's terms. And they not only didn't have a path to citizenship, they would never be able to pass citizenship on to their children. So citizenship was unattainable. This is like the clearest sense of a binary that can't be crossed, even across multiple generations. So I think the medics really illustrates a kind of an extreme version of the situation that we're in now, where for undocumented immigrants, at least we have birthright citizenship. Right? Even if you don't build the pathway to citizenship that I think many would like to see, in the next generation, the life might be different and it might be better. And that is, of course, so fundamentally the dream of a lot of immigrant parents is, they come to America because they want a better life for their children. Right? And so that's possible in America. And maybe people forget sometimes, because it is possible, that over the course of several generations, people will be able to get there. Some people will be able to get there. In the medics, that wasn't true. So I think being able to illustrate that and the consequences of continuing down that road of enforcement and being unwilling to build those bridges, I think is a way of thinking about the moment that we're actually in now, and how radical or how doable some of these ideas about legalization that are kind of the centerpiece of that Citizenship Act of 2021, why we would do it, and whether it is indeed, beyond the pale of what America and other countries have been able to do for immigrants in moments of reform.
Well, there are two things in what you just said that I want to highlight, and partly because they're important, but also because I think they bring up themes that will come up during the day in various ways. I mean, one is a reminder of another big part of your argument, which is that citizenship is not binary, right? That maybe as a formal matter we're citizens or not, but to move away from this idea that it is a binary, and so I just wanted to call attention to that, and I mean, as in the time we have left, you could say more about that, or it'll come up during the day. But the other thing I think it's important you bring up is that naturalization is just one way to get citizenship, and the other way to get citizenship, if you really want to put it in broad categories, is to be born a citizen, and that this is not the situation for the medics, but at least under what I understand to be prevailing law. And the Constitution, 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution, the birthright citizenship rule mitigates the situation for people who may be undocumented or who aren't citizens, and so as a trade-off, I'm just curious about this. I'm not sure this is so much a question, but sort of invitation to comment, is that a lot of debates we have today about the acquisition of citizenship, whether it be through naturalization or most acutely in the political arena, legalization with the path to citizenship, they might be very different sorts of conversations. We might be having very different sorts of conversations if there were no 14th Amendment, almost as if it's a backstop, I suppose, generationally. At least the children will get it. And maybe one of the trade-offs, I'm not suggesting this, but I'd just be surprised if it doesn't come up sometimes. That does come up sometimes in these negotiations, is that we'll give people more legal status but it'll be the next generation and not the people legalized who will have a path to citizenship that's practical and within a reasonable time frame.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, one thing you're alluding to is one of the ideas that I think I realized only halfway through the book came from you, which is your first book, Americans in Waiting. And, you know, you talk about there being different models of citizenship. And the one I've always been the most fascinated by, and that I think speaks the most to the people I interviewed for this book, is this idea about transition. Right? This be able to, you know, if we talk about a binary, it's about having two fixed spots. If we talk about pathways to citizenship, it's about moving between those two fixed spots. Right? It's about transitioning between those different statuses, between those legal categories. And so I think in a lot of ways, this is a book that is about transitioning. I love the title of your book, Americans in Waiting. When I gave the TED Talk version of this book, we talked a lot about future Americans or citizens to be. You know, and again, if we're talking about undocumented immigrants, we don't necessarily mean formal citizens to be unless there is a legalization program, which of course, even if there is, it won't capture everybody in the same ways that DACA didn't capture everybody. But the other thing that I think is interesting is, you know, a lot of the policies that have been coming out of the Biden administration so far, or that have been proposed by the Biden administration, I think people really do focus on just this one piece. Of wanting to turn undocumented immigrants into citizens. But in reality, the bill actually does a lot more than that. One of the provisions I'm really interested in is what it would do for temporary workers, especially farm workers who are not in this book. Because, you know, I think that we've seen over the last year how important the work is of a lot of these people who are coming and, you know, to use a word that has a lot of meaning these days, who are providing essential work to our country. And if you look at those provisions, though, it's not just the binary. There's this idea of blue cards in addition to green cards that can help to stabilize someone's status that might not automatically lead to a green card. It might not automatically lead to citizenship, but it's about building footholds. And literally building a path, you know, that has several different cobblestones along the way. And so, you know, I think that idea is true to the immigrant experience, but I think it's also a pretty important and sophisticated idea that's built into some of these newer policies in a way that not everybody in the media, not everyone in the public is seeing and understanding. I think it makes it more doable as well.
Yeah, if I combine, I mean, what you just said with something you said a few minutes ago, I mean, this idea that citizenship is not a binary has at least two dimensions. I mean, one of it has to do with the present moment in different ways. So we can think about this in terms of blue cards, green cards, formal citizenship. That's one way in which it's a spectrum, not a binary, but it's also one that there's a time dimension, one that as we look ahead to the next generation or even 10 years down the road and whether children will become will become citizens or full members. I mean, that's just an interest. I just raised that just because I think it's something that helps frame a lot of the conversations today. You know, I just had two other questions. We just have a few minutes, but one really is about your work, and one is about the conference. And maybe just to make sure we stay on track as far as schedule goes, let me ask both of them, even though they're very different questions. You know. Or maybe they're not different questions. We'll see. I mean, one is I just want to know what's next for you. What projects that's I think anyone who works on a big project at some point has to decide, well, this is this book and that's the next book, and or at least the next set of projects. And I'm curious what working on this has made you want to do next, either methodologically or substantively. And the other, which seems to take things in a different direction, but I realize you could give the same answer to both questions, is if you say something about the structure of the conference and sort of it touches on a lot of areas where conversations are started by your book, but your book doesn't try to address particularly. And I think it's worth, especially as we get into the panels, to ask you not only to talk about what you're going to work on next, but also how the conference is organized the way it is, why the panels organized the way they are, and why they're in the order they are. Anything you want to say about that?
Sure. So I'll start with the first question, and I'll keep it short, but I'm of course very happy to talk more with anyone in the audience, but especially the people who are here today. This is one of those moments where I really do wish that we could have the lunches and the coffees and the receptions and the breaks so that we could talk about what we're working on next. But I think the most natural next step for this book was to think about how to bridge the gaps that I'm talking about. So essentially, outside of the book, I had been working on a piece called Silent Second Wall. You know, if we understand the first wall to be the border wall, that the second wall is the more administrative barrier that a lot of immigrants face, right? And this challenge of integration is part of that second wall, or maybe it's a third wall that goes inside the country. So I think the next natural step for this book was to talk about how you scale the second wall. And I might write that book, but I will say I'm also really influenced by the things that are happening around us. And I think I think they're distinct trends, but maybe they will come together. One is COVID-19 and one is the Black Lives Matter movement. And the recent waves of anti-Asian violence that, again, Suzette referred to in the introduction, and that I've experienced pretty acutely during this past year. And so on the first one, I would say, this idea of essential workers, I already have the book title. I just haven't written any of the pages. I would love to see something, or I'd like to write something on citizenship for essential workers. And it would emerge from the book, mostly from the stories of the vets and the service members. Who I think exemplify something other than the jus sanguinis, jus solis, birthright citizenship that you were alluding to, and the naturalization that we've been talking about throughout this conversation. They have this third path, right? Jus meritus, this idea that you can get citizenship through the merit of your actions and the contributions to a country. And classically, we see that with the military. How else can you show your loyalty to a country other than by putting your life on the line? And I think that it would be interesting. France is doing this, is offering a path to citizenship to those who have performed essential work for the country. So I would like to see writing, whether mine or someone else's, under that title. And then on the Black Lives Matter, again, I have a title, but not a lot of writing. I have a blog post to go with the title, which is Colorblind Nationalism. And I think it really, for me, starts to think about how you bring together the experience of immigrants with this idea of colorblindness, right? Immigrants are, of course, many different colors, but in the law, we sometimes pretend that it's a legal category. It's not the racial category that we have a long history of addressing through the law. I think we have about 1 minute, so let me just say a word about the panels. Thankfully, we've actually already covered a lot of this.
Right.
I think the 3 panels that are coming each address one of these major ideas we've talked about. The first one is to lay the ground by talking about citizenship theory in this really broad sense, including the law, but also going beyond it. I think the second piece is to dig deeper, largely with social scientists, but also with some legal scholars like Stella Elias Birch, among others, who will talk about the integration side of this. And then lastly, the enforcement side of this. And then I also did want to just say that the breakout rooms, I think, are where we're going to talk about the policy piece. So it's every piece that we've talked about pretty much in order.
Okay, thank you so much. And I see that we're really about out of time. I'll thank you so much, Ming, for writing the book and having this conversation. I wish we could all walk over to Basemore Shopping Center and have a cup of coffee right now. But instead, let me turn it over to Suzette.
Thank you.
Thank you. I feel the same way. I'm so excited about your upcoming work, Ming. You've got amazing ideas, and so really can hardly wait to see what you do next. Thank you again for allowing us to be a fly on the wall on this very important conversation. So at this time, we are going to shift gears. Professor Chen, Professor Motomura, thank you so much for your hard work and for sharing your thoughts. We're going to take a 15-minute break. Professor Chen has done a beautiful job of sort of setting up what the rest of the day is going to look like. And so we'll ask our panelists, Professor Chen, Professor Motomura, to exit our Zoom at this time. And what we'll do is we'll bring up a screen that is going to give you some information about the next upcoming panel. It's going to be in 15 minutes. And so that will be at 10:15 Mountain Time. At that point, we'll be going into panel number 1, which is citizenship theory beyond legal status. And for that panel, we actually do have Q&A available. So for those of you who are participating by webinar, feel free to send us your questions. We'll have an opportunity for you to be able to ask some of the panelists questions and share some of your ideas. Okay, so we look forward to everybody taking a break, and we'll resume at 10:15 Mountain Time. Thank you very much. Okay, I see that our break is getting ready to come to a close. We have about a minute before we get started with the next panel. So we'll give folks a chance to go ahead and join us at this time. Great, I'm seeing a number of the folks from panel number 1 populating the screen, so thank you. Welcome back, everybody. I'd like to get us started on our first panel, Citizenship Theory Beyond Legal Status. Good news for this one, you will be able to ask questions. You can post them in the Q&A. So feel free to join the conversation. Just a quick reminder, the program for the day is posted in the chat, so you can go online to take a look at that. And also a link to a virtual reception that we're having at the end of the day. So feel free to stick with us the entire day or come in and out of sessions as you choose, but try to join us at the end of the day where we will be able to do sort of a virtual reception, have more informal conversation, actually bring you in with us to do a deeper dive on any of the topics that have been covered today, or figure out what you can do in terms of action steps moving forward. So let's start off by just introducing the moderator for panel 1, Seema Sohi. Professor Sohi is an associate professor of ethnic studies at the University of Colorado in Boulder. I mentioned that we have an incredible lineup of interdisciplinary scholars, and so I'm excited about Professor Sohi and her background. She has published a book, Echoes of Mutiny: Race, Surveillance, and Indian Anti-Colonialism in North America, published by Oxford University Press in 2014. She has also published numerous essays and articles in the Journal of American History, Sikh Formations, and an anthology entitled The Sun Never Sets: South Asian Migrants in an Age of U.S. Power, published by NYU Press in 2013. So just a really impressive and exciting background. So I'm so happy to have Professor Sohi with us. And at this point, would like to turn the conversation over to her for panel number 1. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suzette, for that introduction. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here. I am thrilled to be moderating this fantastic panel titled Citizenship Theory Beyond Legal Status. This panel, the idea of this panel is derived from Professor Chen's wonderful book, Pursuing Citizenship, and is really engaged with a couple of ideas. Some have argued, as Professor Chen has, that the citizen-alien binary should be instead reframed as a spectrum of citizenship, a concept that emphasizes continuities between the otherwise distinct experiences of membership and belonging for those seeking to become citizens, both legally and substantively. This session will explore a range of theoretical approaches to citizenship historically and in the contemporary moment. And we have a fantastic set of scholars here. And at this point, I'd like to introduce Emma Carroll, who's going to introduce our panelists. Emma is a second-year law student here at CU Boulder who hopes to pursue a career in immigration law. She has interned at Novo Legal and also was a judicial extern at the 20th Judicial District County Court. And this summer, she will intern at the Office of the Chief Administrative Hearing Officer. So with that, I will pass it on to Emma, and then we will hear from each of the panelists for about 10 minutes about their work and this question about citizenship theory, and we will have time for Q&A at the end. So please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A. Thanks, Emma.
Thank you, Seema, for that welcome. It's wonderful to join you all today for this panel discussion on citizenship theory beyond legal status. And I'm honored to get to introduce you to our distinguished panelists for this morning. Our first panelist is Naomi Carter. And Professor Carter is an associate professor of political science at Howard University. She received her PhD in political science from Duke University, working primarily in American politics with a specific focus on racial and ethnic politics, Black politics, public opinion, and political behavior. In her award-winning book, American While Black, African Americans, Immigration, and the Limits of Citizenship, Professor Carter examines African American public opinion on immigration. Her work has appeared in numerous publications, such as the Journal of Politics, Political Psychology, Journal of Women, Politics and Policy, and Journal of African American Studies, among others. Professor Carter's other work examines majority Black cities as immigrant sanctuaries, the politics of lynching, and the meaning of citizenship for African Americans at the turn of the 19th century. Today, Professor Carter will be discussing the topic of citizens first, immigration as a strategy for Black liberation. Our second panelist is Elizabeth Cohen. Professor Cohen is professor of political science at Syracuse University and associate editor of the American Journal of Political Science. Professor Cohen has authored 4 books, including Illegal: How America's Lawless Immigration Regime Threatens Us All, The Political Value of Time, Citizenship, Duration, and Democratic Justice, Semi-Citizenship and Democratic Politics, and Citizenship. In addition to her scholarly writing, Professor Cohen has also published op-eds in newspapers such as The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and Politico. Professor Cohen's research interests focus on immigration, contemporary political theory, justice, citizenship, and rights. In fall of 2020 and spring of 2022, she will be on leave at the Princeton University Center for Human Values, where she will work on a book about the political significance of line waiting and the rise of short-term immigration in the contemporary United States. And today, Professor Cohen will be discussing the topic of opening the gates, how the US can transcend histories of immigrant exclusion. Our third panelist is Amanda Frost. Professor Frost is the Anne Loeb Bronfman Distinguished Professor Law and Government at Washington College of Law. Professor Frost writes and teaches in the fields of constitutional law, immigration and citizenship law, federal courts and jurisdiction, and judicial ethics. Her scholarship has been cited by over a dozen federal and state courts, and she's been invited to testify on the topics of her articles before both the House and Senate Judiciary Committees. Her non-academic writing has been published in The Atlantic, Slate, The American Prospect, The New Republic, The Washington Post, The New York Times, and USA Today. She also currently authors the Academic Roundup column for SCOTUS blog. In 2019, Professor Frost was awarded a fellowship from the American Council of Learned Societies to complete her book, You Are Not American: Citizenship Stripping from Dred Scott to the Dreamers. Sorry, it's kind of a tongue twister, which was published just this past January. Professor Frost will be discussing the topic of Unmaking Americans, Citizenship Stripping and the Meaning of American. And our final panelist for today is Alan Colburn. Professor Colburn is an assistant professor of political science in the School of Social and Behavioral Sciences at Arizona State University. Professor Colburn is the lead author of the book Citizenship Reimagined, a new framework for state rights in the United States. He's also a Presidential Award recipient from the Russell Sage Foundation and Carnegie Corporation. Professor Colburn's research has been featured in the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times. And this morning, Professor Colburn will be discussing the topic, Reimagining Citizenship as a Federated and Multidimensional Right-Based Framework. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to our panelists, starting with Professor Carter to start us off.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Seema, for putting this together. This is great. I'm looking forward to dialoguing with you all. So I'm going to share my screen because I have a few slides here. So I changed the title a little bit because as I'm thinking about this, what I was trying to get to is this notion that, you know, when Black people were not citizens, how were they thinking about what their freedom could look like? And in many cases, they had to find that freedom. So I was really interested in thinking about how these movements to seek freedom often overlook or disregard the Black experience, because I think many times people take for granted that Black Americans in particular are indigenous to the United States and or have been here so long that of course they've always been citizens, but that's not true. And it certainly isn't the case that many Black people who are administratively citizens feel like citizens in the present. And I included here this Blacksit. It was a hashtag that trended about 4 years ago, or 5 years ago in 2016. And it was originally intended, I think, to be a joke, right? How different America would be without Black people. But it pulled on this longer string of Black people really talking about themselves as stateless people and using immigration and moving to other locales to achieve some version of what freedom looked like. Right. And so even though this was written in 2016 and I'm thinking about this, 200 years prior, it still is the case that Black people are thinking about and speaking about and talking through immigration as a viable strategy for their own inclusion. So I am talking about this again in this moment because I really want to broaden the narrative of Black migration, which has largely been treated again as a domestic phenomenon, and bring Black people from the margins to the center of these discussions around immigration. And I think it helps us better understand not just sort of the ways that Black people use movement to achieve freedom, but a better way to understand Black agency and how they use that agency to withstand incursions of white supremacy. And while I'm, thinking through this, of course, I think back to Africa movements, as they've been popularly coined, should be understood and reconsidered as more robust and more successful, perhaps, than we've considered. So I started thinking about this project because many times Back to Africa movements are treated as sort of a separatist nationalist strain that didn't really do anything because most Black people didn't leave America. But I think what people miss is, particularly in taking Back to Africa literally, is the fact that Black people were really just talking about how to discover a space where they would be more free. I think Africa was sort of the ultimate articulation of this, but certainly the continent was not the end all be all. If it meant leaving the United States, Blacks were willing to do so and not really particular about where they went. Some could make it to the continent of Africa, but others could make it to Mexico. Others still could make it to Canada. And I am talking about Back to Africa as a stand-in and a metaphor for space that would allow Black people the freedom to be whole human beings. For this reason, Canada became the more popular choice, not because Black people had any particular axe to grind with the continent of Africa, but because Canada was proximate to the United States. The climate was similar, so people didn't have to contend with tropical disease. The language was similar. And They had abolished slavery in 1793 and had a rather lax policy when it came to Black immigrants. So considered in this light, I argue that Back to Africa movements are not failures, but should be considered as political strategy for Black people. Now, the push and pull factors of this, I think, are something that many of us probably on this call in this room understand, as the United States had long tried to create a space where Black people were made uncomfortable, particularly for those Black people who were free. Now, because Black people were free didn't mean that they were citizens. And because their presence, right, upset the sort of balance of power where your color became your status, the problem was considered the Negro problem, right? These free Black people were gumming up the works for how we want to organize ourselves racially. And so when the United States is moving toward a more draconian enforcement of fugitive slave laws, the anxiety for Blacks increases, and rightly so. I mean, this is a country, because your color meant your status, all Black people were endangered to some extent by these kinds of laws being on the books. And even places that had typically been viewed as free states became dangerous for Black people as states as vast as Illinois and Ohio started raising the stakes for free people, free Black people to be within their borders. So in response to many of these incursions on the limited freedoms that some Blacks enjoy, you had men like Henry Highland Garnet and Frederick Douglass debating sort of whether Black people should stay in the United States or go abroad. Garnet in 1843 wrote one of his most famous pieces, which was an address to the slaves of the United States of America, which urged rebellion. And in 1859, he helped found the African Colonization Society, which would have supported Blacks repatriating to the continent of Africa. And his argument was that if Black people were going to leave the United States, it had to be on their own steam, that they couldn't rely on white organizations like the American Colonization Society. Frederick Douglass took the opposite tack and was committed as an abolitionist and didn't see immigration as desirable nor useful for Blacks. He argued that Black people had built this country and therefore should not cede their investment to this nation, and that what they needed to do was stay in this country and advocate for enslaved Blacks. And that is majority what most Black people did. I'm sorry. The majority of Black people did what Douglass advised and stayed in this country. Yet there were a number of Black people who decided that they were going to leave because repression was not a Southern problem. It was an American problem. And so there were Black people who were already sort of using the routes of the Underground Railroad to get themselves to Canada, because in Canada, they could earn a living, they could own property, and they could also vote in Canada if they, of course, met the property requirements. Earlier still, before these sort of moments of the Fugitive Slave Act, you had between 1793 and 1865, somewhere around 30,000 Black folks going to Canada. And many of them went initially as loyalists. So these were people who fought for the British during the Revolution and were taken to Canada outside of the United States. And this is important because it's not that Black people were just going to Canada and staying. Black people were going to Canada and advocating for the end of enslavement, but also thinking about what a new possibility for their communities could be. And you had women like Mary Ann Shadd Cary, who published her Provincial Freeman and to be an activist paper, to be activists on the other side of the border for their sisterhood and their brethren in bondage. And she left the United States in 1850 with her family, but she, like so many others, was keeping an eye on what happened in the United States and was thinking about coming back, which many actually did post the Civil War. So all of this project is really trying to think through what back to Africa actually really means. And it's not literal for most Black people. Whether you're looking at elites like Martin Delaney who are writing about this, or even workaday people, the idea is to get where Black people can be free. And if they're thinking about that freedom, they're also devising their own freedom dreams, as Robin Kelly would say, about what a notion of the best life looks like for Black people, about what it means to truly be part of the body politic. And so it makes Black people not only think about what freedom can be, but what their demands are going to be for this country if and when they choose to return. So very much immigration is used by Black people, not just in this moment, but throughout the 20th century. The Great Migration, again, is treated as a domestic type of process, but we know the movements of Black people during this period of time also have lots of implications for immigration law at that time, but it's also part of this larger narrative about Black mobility and where Black people can go. And part of where they can go is about what they can dream. So I'll stop here.
Great, thank you so much, Professor Carter. Next, we'll have Professor Cohen.
Thank you so much. It's like a gigantic honor to be here among all these incredible scholars and also people with really high quality Zoom backgrounds. I'm really excited to get to talk about material that relates all of our work and that relates back to this excellent book, Pursuing Citizenship. And I've been, excited for the book to come out and then excited to help promote it for a while because it is deeply connected to things I've been interested in for a long time. Pursuing Citizenship, for any folks who haven't read it, builds toward a story about the decision to naturalize that's made by lawful permanent residents in the US. And LPR status is in some senses a pretty privileged one. It's acquired by a minority of would-be or current residents of a country that still manages to think of itself and is on the top of the list of places that a lot of would-be immigrants around the world hope to go or to come. And with LPR status come many of the rights held by full citizens, so a much more robust set of rights than, in fact, some US-born citizens experience, for example, people who've been incarcerated, but it's not citizenship. And one of the starkest reminders of this fact is that approximately 10% of all people who are deported by the United States each year actually are LPRs. So it's fragile in its own way. Pursuing Citizenship draws on work that I did a long time ago and that I've kind of, set aside, but have been interested in coming back to, and that's the book, Semi-Citizenship in Democratic Politics. And the Pursuing Citizenship kind of delves into this idea that democracies produce partial citizenship, something we've already been talking about during this panel. And then uses this as a premise for studying how people who have the choice to naturalize make that decision. And Professor Chen enters into this research with a really thoughtful argument about something that too many people just assume without questioning, and that is that it is preferable for people to naturalize, largely because this means, barring unrelated civil disabilities, that they become full citizens. And the gist of the argument is not just that there are legal protections that only come with naturalization, but also a host of de facto forms of citizenliness that and engagement with civil society that are more likely to be acquired by people who naturalize. And these manifestations of citizenliness have tangible value, not just for the people enacting them, but for all of us, members of communities where those people will be practicing citizenship, and for democracy itself. And I would describe kind of the underlying normative argument here in which naturalization acquires a really high value as kind of revealing a form of contingency in which basically you kind of have to possess certain rights of citizenship and others are contingent upon possessing that. So you will not get the right to vote unless you apply for what I would term legal nationality, right? Naturalization. But actually, that's really just the right of free movement and residence. That's what comes with that. The idea that you will not be deported, that you can always re-enter the country. You never have to worry about that. And when we make rights contingent on each other, you have to get this to get that. It implies, I think that, and I've argued this, that these rights have a relationship to each other, that like you actually need your political rights to protect your civil rights, or you need your civil rights in order to be able to properly exercise your political rights, and so on and so forth. And that's true, right? Like we need to have rights of free expression, for example, in order to really fully exercise our political rights to vote and other participatory rights. But we might want to push back a little bit against the idea that in order to have one set of rights, people are required to have another set of rights. There's no reason in particular that rights of residence and free movement need to be related to the right to vote. So I, as a natural born citizen, won't lose my right to vote if I travel abroad, nor should I, right? There's really no logical relationship between those two things. And keeping rights distinct and independent from one another ensures that when someone can't exercise or isn't allowed to exercise one type of right, that we don't necessarily have to deprive them of all of their citizenship. They can keep that or those other things intact. In fact, I think maybe part of why we don't value enough civil society rights and representation that's available to non-citizens is because we so overvalue voting. We tend to underemphasize everything that leads up to the people's decisions to get politically involved or not. And I think, Professor Chen's book does a really good job of reminding us to think about that in some really important ways. But I also think let's question what it means to accept that rights are contingent on each other, and this gatekeeper right of legal nationality, which really prevents a lot of people in the United States from exercising almost any rights. There are lots of instances in the U.S. history of groups that experience a kind of cascade of disenfranchisement in which laws and practices that deny them one kind of rights effectively deny them other types of rights. I think no group in contemporary society embodies this as much as the undocumented immigrant. And I'm going to turn now to talking about the political experience of undocumented immigrants. So an undocumented immigrant is somebody who has no rights of residence and free movement. An authorized visitor, a different type of immigrant, would have essentially like a visa as a temporary passport that grants them the right to be in a place and move around freely for the duration of that visa. And with that will come some other rights in general, not a really robust set of rights, but some rights that depend in part on the length and conditions of the visa. But the undocumented immigrant doesn't get any of those rights because we have made most other rights contingent on the right to stay and reside. So undocumented immigrants are currently counted for purposes of apportionment. There's obviously a big fight about this, but as long as Democrats have their way, that's happening. But the quality of representation that yields in Congress varies. Some members of Congress stand up for the interests of undocumented workers, and others actually do the opposite. So I want to think about the fact that we are in a position where rights remain contingent, and in order for undocumented immigrants to have almost any other rights besides those very thin, unreliable rights of representation, naturalization is really still necessary. We didn't always have the figure of the undocumented immigrants. It's a relatively new thing, and the lawyers and historians in the room will be totally familiar with this, but we did exclude, we disenfranchised, we deported, we did all kinds of rights denial to people who weren't born in the US and to people who were born in the United States. But the specific legal figure of someone who doesn't have authorization paperwork, permission to reside and move around freely, recognized by the federal government, dates back to 1929. In my opinion, there's kind of arguments about this, but I'm going to explain why I make that argument. So 1929 is comes 5 years after the first comprehensive immigration reform in the United States, when we decided to exclude ostensibly non-white immigrants and really ended a lot of immigration coming in that had been coming in at a high rate for 40 years. 1929 is the year that Congress really commits to enforcing by imposing penalties for being in the country without authorization. So prior to that time, even though there were deportations from time to time, there were no fines, no prison time, none of those sorts of federally enforced punishments for being in the US without papers. And probably because of this, there was almost no federal infrastructure for checking people's status or punishing people who were out of status. Again, like Texas Rangers were down at the border deporting people, and our borders were certainly not open in either direction. And when we did deport people, it was very often on the basis of race, whether we used facially neutral mechanisms or not. But there was no massive customs and border protection, no immigration and customs enforcement. There was not even an INS, Immigration and Naturalization Services, for people who are old like me and remember that. That doesn't come about till the early 1930s. And that was an agency that did a little bit of border patrol, but then a lot of like naturalizing and things like that, all in one agency. It's really hard to imagine that what is now the largest federal law enforcement agency in the country didn't exist until less than 100 years ago. In fact, we didn't even really have much of a border patrol until after 2002. It wasn't nearly as large and expensive as it is now, 2002 being when we got the Department of Homeland Security. But the change really happens in 1929 under what is called the Registry Act. And I was really curious about registry. I have been since around 2009, and I don't know if Hiroshi is still at this event, but I was hanging out at New York Law School at an event where Hiroshi was on a panel, and like I'd heard of registry before, but I didn't really know as a non-lawyer how seriously I could take it. But there were all these law professors there chatting about renewing registry and what it would do. And so I got curious and committed to later doing this project. So I wrote a book about 18 months ago about undocumented immigration in the US and about enforcement in particular. And that gave me the opportunity to go back and look at the congressional debates around the Registry Act. The registry is intended to be punitive. It was these punishments for people who didn't have authorization. When I went back and looked at the discussions around these punishments, I also noticed that there were a lot of letters being read on the floor of Congress from constituents. And they were basically saying, like, we're really, really worried about the fact that we have all these people who've been living in the country that didn't have papers because we weren't giving out papers before. Some of them actually shouldn't be here, but in any case, they've all been here for a long time. They do jobs, they have families, they're raising their kids here, and they have no papers and they think they're going to be deported. They're not the people we want to let into the country, like they come from bad countries, but they've been here, and it's really embarrassing that they're afraid of being deported. So in addition to punishments in 1929 in the Registry Act, Congress inserts this provision that says if you have been in the country since 1921, we're going to give you a pathway to citizenship. It was a big old amnesty. And the justification was like that it would be really embarrassing and un-American to either deport people who've been acting in a citizenly fashion in every way, or let them go on with this perpetual form of semi-citizenship. And the underlying commitment here is something I think I also owe to Hiroshi's work. And that is that since the US was founded, the idea was that you want to attract immigrants who plan to stay, that those are the best possible people because they're really committed to democracy in a lot of the ways that Professor Chen is talking about in Pursuing Citizenship. The word for that was intentioner, and an intentioner was more desirable than somebody who would come and do some work and earn some money and then leave. And somebody who is going to have to live with a long period of non-citizenship is probably not going to want to come and commit to the democracy. So we have to have a way, in fact, how we get, a form of naturalization that far surpasses existing European possibilities at the time. The congressmen were ashamed, and they built into this law this provision, which is a pathway to citizenship. Registry at the time, it was pinned to 1921. So it grew obsolete, obviously, over time. That date becomes further and further in the past. It's been updated a few times since 1929. And one of the things that's really interesting, if you go through and look at the discussions about updating it, is each time there's massive nativism in the discussions of what should be done about immigration, like really nativist exclusionary moments when we're not letting almost anybody into the United States. But always the idea that, well, if you have been here for a while, then we kind of need to do something about the fact that you don't have citizenship. And this changes, right? Because obviously I'm describing something that's utterly foreign to Congress in 2021. The most recent update to registry was 1986, which was not coincidentally the year that we also did the only one-time amnesty we've done in the United States. And we set the date to 1973. So it doesn't apply to almost anybody in the United States now. Almost no one is eligible. But I think it's really interesting to think about in the context of 2021 politics. The undocumented immigration population in the United States stopped growing in around 2007, 2008. It kind of plateaus. And it's declined considerably, over 10% since then. The number of people arrested for entering the country without a valid visa or without an inspection by USCIS, as opposed to overstaying a visa, is as low as it's been since 1972. All of this is like pre-Trump. It has nothing to do with Trump, and it's backed up by data from Pew Hispanic Center, Center for Migration Studies, Homeland, DHS itself backs this up. And it's like, this pattern starts really just as we've been building a massive enforcement and deportation infrastructure. So we started like spending the most money we've ever spent on this right around when the population of undocumented immigrants in the US starts shrinking. We spend around $18 billion a year on enforcement. Customs and Border Protection is the largest federal law enforcement agency. It's like much bigger than the FBI, the DEA, 60,000 employees, and like way more problems. You know, a Customs and Border Protection agent is about 5 times more likely to have been arrested than any other law enforcement agent in the country. The budget for ICE, right, which does interior policing, is 10 times larger than the budget for all immigration related infrastructure, like that would have been INS in 1993. It's 10 times larger, and they take money from the Coast Guard, they take money from the Army, the other military, other security. Biden, a lot of that money ends up in private hands, right? Because we do a lot of private incarceration, and Biden is committed to ending that for federal inmates, but not for ICE. So very little is likely to change. And it's also really interesting to note that this has a lot of effect for US citizens. So I go through in that book and talk about like large numbers of US citizens end up targeted and incarcerated with the intent to deport because we have such a large deportation infrastructure. So it kind of, you know, interesting how citizenship enforcement backfires on citizens as well. So I think it's worth stepping back and considering in a context where we know undocumented immigrants who are not asylum seekers, set aside asylum seekers, which is a distinct dilemma. We just kind of we've grown more and more committed to that distinction that we made in 1929, but in ways that aren't necessarily productive for citizens or non-citizens. So I think it's worth.
Professor Cohen, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to let you know that we are over time.
Okay, so I'm actually quite close to finishing.
Okay, thank you so much. And I'm so sorry.
Thank you for letting me know. Yeah, so I actually just wanted to end this by discussing the fact that we have a law on the books, and we could be using this. We could actually at any point update registry. It just requires long-term residency, which is the exact condition of our undocumented population in the US today. I'm kind of like on a campaign to do this in case it's not obvious, but I think an ongoing way for us to recognize the citizenization of long-term non-citizens would be to allow a rolling registry, an opportunity to naturalize, and to kind of transcend the thing that has brought us to this point in which we're spending a lot of money on enforcement and enforcing against the idea of citizenship more generally. Okay.
Thank you so much, Professor Cohen. And now we will hear from Professor Frost.
Great, thank you so much for the invitation to speak here today. Thanks to Suzette, thanks to Seema and Emma and all the incredible work that's gone into this conference. And particularly thanks to Professor Chen and her book, which has been a really useful source for me as I think about framing and theorizing my own work on citizenship stripping. And I use that term as a catch-all because I'm not talking about only denaturalization, although that's certainly included. I'm also talking about denying people citizenship who were born in the United States, and also proof of citizenship regimes that end up effectively or de facto taking away citizenship, even if they don't formally deny that someone born in the United States is a citizen. So I found that Professor Chen's ideas about the spectrum of citizenship, the idea that it's not a binary, an on-off switch, actually is very applicable to my work. She in her book focus very much on these semi-citizen categories, as Elizabeth Cohen has put it, and as Ming talks about in her book, liminal citizenship, people without a path to citizenship. But in fact, I think that spectrum of citizenship idea that she describes in her book applies very much to my end of the spectrum, which is people who have citizenship, formal legal status of citizenship, and are told you are no longer an American. So I'm going to give 3 quick examples of this to illustrate my point here. And the first example I'm giving is Hiram Rhodes Revels. He is the first African-American member of Congress elected in 1870. He was born in 1827, so of course he was about 30 when Dred Scott was decided, telling him, you are not a citizen. He was a free Black man, not a slave. So he had, I'm sure, thought of himself as a US citizen. And of course, some African-Americans had some civil and political rights in the northern states. So that decision was a blow, but then he, of course, went through the Civil War and then saw the 14th Amendment and its citizenship clause added to our Constitution, overruling Dred Scott and giving him back the citizenship that I would argue he'd had before. And then he's elected to be the senator for Mississippi, which was an amazingly symbolic moment since the last person to hold that position was Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy. Everyone recognized it was an enormously symbolic moment. Hiram Rhodes Revels goes to take his seat in the Senate, but he is not seated immediately because some of his colleagues argue that he is still not a citizen. Now, some said he was not 9 years a citizen, which you need to be a member of the Senate, and that was the problem. But others argued that the 14th Amendment itself was not good law and could not change the citizenship status of people like Hiram Rhodes Revels. So Senator Salisbury from Delaware said that the 14th Amendment is no more a part of the Constitution than anything which you might write upon a piece of paper and fling upon the floor. And Senator Garrett Davis of Kentucky called it a farce. So for 3 days, there was a battle on the Senate floor, and eventually Hiram Rhodes Revels was seated and served his term. He lived long enough, however, to see the end of, if not formal citizenship for African Americans, certainly most of the rights and privileges of citizenship that they had enjoyed during Reconstruction, as the federal government abandoned that project. And particularly in the South, but frankly, throughout the United States, those rights and privileges were eroded or disappeared. He lived long enough to see that, despite having actually served in Congress. And I'll also point out, I was really struck by the fact that of the 11 African-American senators in the United States, 3 have had their citizenship questioned. Hiram Rhodes Revels, Barack Obama, of course, as president, and Kamala Harris, whose citizenship was questioned by President Trump and others the summer she was nominated. So my second story of citizenship stripping as an example of how even once you have citizenship, you might be on the spectrum of citizenship or have a fragile citizenship, is Wong Kim Ark, the named plaintiff in the case establishing birthright citizenship. So he was born in the United States in San Francisco in 1870, lived in the United States most of his life, but he traveled to China to visit relatives. And when he came back in the mid-1890s, the United States government told him, we concede you were born in the United States, but we don't think you're a citizen. And we read the citizenship clause to exclude you because you're the children of immigrants. And we think the child of an immigrant is not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, and so falls within an exception under the citizenship clause. So Wong Kim Ark takes his case up to the US Supreme Court to prove his citizenship. And really remarkably to me, the man who argued that case, Holmes Conrad, Solicitor General of the United States, a former Confederate officer, he doesn't just argue that technical point about the language of the 14th Amendment, excluding Wong Kim Ark, and by the way, also excluding all the children of immigrants, as Wong's lawyer pointed out, probably wisely as a matter of strategy, also the children of English immigrants and Irish immigrants and Scottish immigrants, tens of thousands of people would overnight lose their citizenship and their right to vote and other rights if the United States had prevailed in that case. But the Solicitor General doesn't just limit his arguments to that. He also says the 14th Amendment itself is invalid because if the southern states were coerced into signing it. And I'm fascinated by this because I'd really love to know if there's ever an example of the US government going before the Supreme Court and arguing that the US Constitution is itself unconstitutional, which was what he argued. But he lost. Wong Kim Ark was pronounced a citizen by the United States Supreme Court, and the immigration status of parents was no longer a ground for depriving anyone of citizenship. But interestingly, some archival research I did in the course of writing my book, You Are Not an American, it showed that Wong's citizenship battles were not over. I found records that showed that Wong was arrested in 1901 and detained and nearly deported by immigration officials who did not believe he was a US citizen. And he had to convince them, no, I'm the Wong Kim Ark who won the US Supreme Court case establishing birthright citizenship for the nation. And he did succeed in doing that. But it's an example of the fragility of his citizenship, first as a formal legal matter, but later as a matter of proving it. Because of course, white people at this point were not stopped near the border and told, we don't believe you're a citizen. It was the fact that he was a Chinese American that had led to him being targeted. And that still happens today. The work of Jacqueline Stevens and other scholars have shown that mistaken detention and deportation occur all too frequently, as many living near the southern border know, and it's often, if not nearly always, based on race. And so the last story I want to tell is of Parvez Khan. Now, Parvez Khan was one of the 700,000 Americans targeted by the Trump administration in the denaturalization campaign that ramped up during the 4 years that Trump was in office. And he was from Pakistan originally, but he'd been over 10 years a US citizen. He'd naturalized. He had a US citizen wife and child, no criminal record. I went to his denaturalization trial, which was held in Jacksonville, Florida, to watch one of these cases go forward. And what I was most struck by was that Parvez Khan's brother testified on Parvez Khan's behalf, just to affirm the facts that Parvez Khan had testified to about his entry and his citizenship. And the brother, when it came time for the government to cross-examine the brother, they didn't ask him about his testimony involving Parvez Khan. They asked about his own naturalization record. What was the process he went through? What was the basis? And it was very clear they were questioning whether he should lose his citizenship. And this sent a very clear message to everyone in that courtroom. It was, if you're a naturalized citizen and you bring yourself to the attention of the government, you can expect the government will start looking closely at your record. You can keep your citizenship. And I think Masha Gessen, the New Yorker reporter who herself is a naturalized citizen, put this best when she said, the denaturalization campaign by the Trump administration and I'm quoting her here, is itself undoing the naturalization of more than 20 million naturalized citizens in the American population by taking away their assumption of permanence. All of them, all of us, are second-class citizens now. So it didn't matter that Masha Gessen may or may not have been targeted for an investigation. She knew now that as a naturalized citizen, she had a fragile citizenship. On that spectrum that Professor Chen discusses, her citizenship is now weaker and more precarious. And I'm going to conclude by just pointing out that maybe this is because really this isn't exactly about citizenship at all or immigration status. Those are proxies for denying rights and privileges and membership and a sense of belonging that sadly this country is always engaged in. And as some of those more overt bases of discrimination became off limits and unconstitutional and illegal, the government turns to citizenship as a proxy for questioning both the exercise of legal rights and the sense of belonging and membership by the members of these same groups. So thanks to Professor Chen for helping me frame my thoughts about this issue in that way. And I'll stop here.
Wonderful. Thank you, Professor Frost. And last but not least, we have Professor Colburn.
Hey there, thank you so much for having me. So I'm going to share just a few slides as I talk through. And so today my talk is on my book that just recently came out, Citizenship Reimagined. And I want to kind of begin my talk with kind of recapping some of our dominant understandings of citizenship. So for nearly 100 years or so, repressive Jim Crow laws have effectively denied African Americans their rights that were guaranteed under the 14th to 15th Amendment. We're seeing today new politics and state laws restricting rights around voting rights and a range of other rights, including the right to protest. And generally, when we think about at least in the US context, citizenship and scholarship around Black politics has really shined a critical light on federalism in its relationship with citizenship rights. And so often we think of federalism as being bad for citizenship rights. And one of the arguments that my co-author and I make in our book is that federalism can actually play a really important progressive role in expanding citizenship rights. States can expand rights beyond what the federal government provides in terms of rights, and we should start to think about the relationship between federal, state, and local as they play an important role in expanding rights in a much more progressive federalism way. So kind of overarching our book is the notion that federal rights set a baseline or a floor for understanding citizenship rights, but they do not provide the ceiling. And so we look at states in the relationship with federal rights, and we look throughout history how states have not just restricted or regressed federal rights, but also how they've pushed and progressed rights at the state level when they don't exist at the federal level. And so our book challenges some key notions of citizenship. It challenges the idea that citizenship rights are exclusively tied to the national level, which is one of the overarching themes in a lot of citizenship scholarship. Here we build on kind of the multi-level or federated scholarship, the subnational citizenship scholarship and global citizenship scholarship, to just rethink what this looks like in the American context. And we argue that citizenship is also multidimensional. So we build on the work of Elizabeth Cohen and others who have really kind of forced us to think more about the rights as opposed to legal status, and to start to challenge the idea that rights are automatically tied to legal status, or that legal status provides a gateway to these rights. That in fact, that these rights exist on their own, and you can build these rights at the federal level and at the state and local levels as well. By creating this federated citizenship framework, we look at 5 core dimensions of rights at each level, and also the relationship between them. So the first dimension of rights that we build on is the right to free movement. And we argue that this is an important dimension of rights on its own. Often we assume that legal status provides you this type of free movement, but we try to disentangle and disconnect it from the idea of legal status. So we argue things like having a driver's license, or having the right to protected free spaces. So the right to travel to or enter government buildings, the right to enter courthouses and hospitals without fear of deportation or other consequences tied to legal status. That's a sense of free movement. The second dimension that we develop in our book of rights is due process and legal protection. So this goes beyond just our traditional notions of due process in terms of criminal rights, but also in terms of the immigration context. So here we can think of things like sanctuary policies providing some kind of legal protection from immigration enforcement. The third dimension of rights that we develop is the right to develop human capital. So here we're looking at rights to healthcare, rights to employment, rights to housing, the range of rights that allow one to live and thrive while living in the United States. And the last 2 dimensions that we expand on for our framework are the right to participate and be represented. So traditionally we think of this as voting rights. We expand that out to think about the right to protest, the right to be counted in the census, these range of rights that allow you to be represented by the government. and then the right to identify and belong. And so in our framework, we look at policies that expressly highlight your belonging. So things like removing alien from labor codes that highlight that you are part of the community and that you are a citizen. And looking at these rights in a federated framework, the book unpacks state citizenship throughout American history. And we do this looking specifically at the African-American experience and also the immigrant experience throughout American history. And we argue that 3 different types of state citizenship emerge: progressive, reinforcing, and regressive. And so when we're thinking about the Jim Crow era with African-Americans, here we're really thinking about regressive state citizenship, where states are regressing, they're taking away rights that the federal government has provided in most cases. When we're thinking about the kind of restrictive Arizona case today around immigration, we're thinking about reinforcing with aspects of regressive state citizenship, where Arizona is trying to mirror federal immigration enforcement. They're trying to expand on top of this federal regime that we've been hearing about today. And then when we think about progressive state citizenship, in our book, we look at the antebellum era and look at how some northern states, not all, provided the right to vote to free Blacks and also allowed some runaway slaves to vote, provided different types of protections and sanctuary to runaway slaves through personal liberty laws. And so we look at what states are doing when the federal government denies rights altogether. And we do this today in the immigration context. And I'll kind of conclude with talking about California. We look today at how California has shifted its kind of historical leadership on exclusion of immigrants through a kind of reinforcing and regressive state citizenship to how it's become and built up this progressive state citizenship that we're seeing today, expanding the rights of undocumented immigrants. And we argue in the book, and we kind of trace the policy history here and the activism that led to it, how California has really expanded rights across all 5 dimensions at the state level through policy, in terms of the right to identify and belong, the right to participate, the right to develop human capital. So in 2013, California granted undocumented residents access to driver's licenses. Around that time, they started to push for the right to healthcare. So now currently, anybody who is under the age of 21 in California, undocumented or not, you have access to full healthcare. And so this is one of the pushes that's continuing in California. California has also recently in 2015 removed the term alien from its labor code, which we argue is Dimension 5. So in a variety of ways, and California is really well known in the news for its various sanctuary type policies that sever its cooperation in terms of enforcing immigration law. So California has done a lot, and this chart here, this figure kind of diagrams at the policy level over time, which of these rights are connected to the types of policies they're passing. And so we can see that this has grown since 2010 exponentially. And this, we argue, is because of democratic leadership and the robustness of the immigrant rights movement in California. Why this matters is particularly in the context of our discussion today, and I'll conclude here, is in the absence of CIR, in the absence of a pathway to naturalize, we need to think about state citizenship in a progressive lens and what states can do to still afford some type of rights and to rethink these rights altogether historically in terms of the role that states should play. So even for those who have citizenship, states and localities, as we know from the Jim Crow era and also in the contemporary era today, these states and local policies still matter for ensuring these rights and for expanding beyond that federal baseline. And so we push for that notion of progressive state citizenship, even despite having naturalization. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of the panelists for sharing their work and for allowing all of us to be part of this conversation. Just a reminder to feel free to type questions in the Q&A, and I will try my best to get to them in the time that we have remaining. So let me begin with this question. for Niambi, Amanda, and Alan, who all talk about the role of race in citizenship as both a formal and substantive limit on full inclusion. And the question is inclusion ever attainable for racial minorities in the US given its founding and present inequality?
Well, I would like to say I'm optimistic, but I don't know that I share that optimism. And I think, part of it is, anti-Blackness as a thing is global, right? None of this is unique to just the US. And I think, that there are places where that inclusion looks more complete than others, but I don't know. And I think in the US case, I think, I'm thinking about the work of Bonnie Honig here and her Democracy and the Foreigner, right? And part of what she asks is, what problems do foreigners solve, right, for the nation? And I think about that in some ways when I think about racial and ethnic minorities, like what problem does that actually solve for the nation? And I was thinking about this moment we're in right now, where we're talking about these sort of upticks in anti-Asian violence. And it's been really interesting to me to watch this, because one of the things that I've noticed is that the face of that violence has been a Black one, right? And in particular, a lot of hand-wringing about why are Black people doing this? Yet there's a man who killed 8 people, 6 of them Asian women, yet Black people still become the sort of violent, right? The thing to be feared. And so if that is sort of where I am seeing where things are right now, I don't know that I'm hopeful that this project can be rescued, right? Because if you think about the founding documents and all of those things, there was a level of comfort and in fact codification of the human treatment of other people based on race, even though it doesn't use race, it doesn't say these people, but the importation of slaves was part of our Constitution. Protection of that property has been kind of a part of who we are, and I don't know that we have done anything affirmative to walk that back. So I am less hopeful.
I'll just add that I don't think we're going to make progress as a country until we face our history in a way that we have yet to do. And I actually see in some European countries some facing of their hard history that they've done better than we have as a country. And so that to me is, I guess, is where I'm hopeful, but I'm frustrated right now, because it shouldn't be the case that we're only just now debating taking down monuments to Robert E. Lee. That's an extraordinary conversation that we have to have now in 2021. So I think if we faced our history, I'd be a little more optimistic. I'd like to think maybe we're moving in that direction. I'll say that one other thing that makes me optimistic, even though it's another sad element in our history, is you look back to the views, for example, of Italian Americans and Italian immigrants, and it was unbelievably racist, unbelievable. The conversations around those immigrants were extraordinary. And yet, obviously, I would say that is, I'm not Italian American, but I would say that people who are Italian American would not feel like social outcasts today the way they were 100 years ago, which just gives me hope, because it makes me think it's possible to have full inclusion of groups for which there was once a very targeted and at times violent animus against them. So I'm hopeful in that regard, but I share Niambi's concerns, obviously. History, I certainly think we won't change.
So I'll briefly just kind of add a little bit more context with California's its shift after Prop 187. It was really in response to 187, but also demographic change had occurred in the state in the 1990s, and then also in the 2000s, where whites are no longer the majority population in the state. You also have this massive kind of movement building that's happening, Latino legislators being elected at the state. So there was this transformation happening at the state level that was important. And I think it's important to think about progress as happening not just nationally, but also at the state and local level on these fronts, which might be ways that can build and create stepping stones for national progress. But at the same time, race is still very vibrant and backlash happens. And so we've seen this, and also, we see this in Orange County today, where kind of white supremacy is growing there. And that's traditionally been the hot spot for the kind of nativist movements that led California in its restrictive days.
Yeah, thank you so much for those answers. And you know, one of the things I was thinking about is that citizenship does continue to be viewed as the dominant mechanism for inclusion, right, in this country. And I understand the reasons for that, but I think that once we understand that citizenship has actually functioned historically as the legal tool for exclusion, particularly through race, then I think that we are left with a framework that actually puts a lot of pressure on the institution of citizenship as the sole mechanism through which we can attain social justice, right? And so I often say, because I teach a class on race and citizenship, and I often say that citizenship is often viewed as sort of the end point, but that in some ways we could reconceptualize it, right, as the beginning point through which we can then imagine other forms or social justice that aren't simply reliant upon the granting of rights. So thank you, that was fantastic. I have a question here for Professor Cohen that says, you gave a date for the start of enforcement that was much earlier than the one suggested by Professor Chen. I suspect Professor Goodman may date the start of enforcement earlier. What criteria do you think each of you are considering when defining enforcement, and how does it matter?
So I don't want to speak for anyone else. I'll just speak for the way that I'm thinking about this. And I think, so I date the creation of a federal figure of the undocumented immigrant to 1929, because prior to that, the federal government wasn't imposing the types of penalties that became possible after 1929. Enforcement itself, and I tried to say this, was happening before that, and in kind of less systematic ways, and there was much less infrastructure. There just wasn't really much of a border patrol. It was anemic even after 1924. But you know, like the Texas Rangers were doing deportations on their own well before that. I don't think you get the opportunity to build up the kind of federal infrastructure that we now have until the basis is laid in 1929. But then, you know, even what we were doing, like the 1990s provide the opportunity for the buildup of a mass incarceration network. But it doesn't really all come to fruition until after DHS was created, and just the amount of resources and the amount of deportation just skyrockets. So I view those as kind of the key steps, DHS being just a terrible agency that was poorly conceived and allowed for its sub-agencies to run amok and run out of control. The scope of that is just different than what was happening prior to that. So that's how I view it. And again, I think there's good reasons to think that people have for thinking differently about these things, but I don't really want to represent other people's views on that myself.
Thanks so much, Professor Cohen. And just a note to the other panelists to feel free to jump in at any point if you want to respond to something that one of your fellow panelists is saying. We have another question that I think is maybe for all of you. So whoever's feeling the most bold can go first. And it reads, states, including Colorado, recently passed laws affirming the principle that only formal US citizens have the right to vote. Do these laws disaggregate substantive economic and social rights from voting in a way that can actually benefit non-citizens in the long term?
Well, I'll jump in if nobody else wants to, just to say, I think the perfect overlap between citizenship and voting today, it's really fascinating to see the history behind that. And my former colleague and now member of Congress, Jamie Raskin, wrote a great article on this, because it didn't used to be the case that you had to be a citizen to vote. And that's where I find it used to be the case that you had rights because you were a white male who owned property, right? So there was a lot of people who were citizens but didn't have all the political and civil rights we think of today as coming with citizenship. And yet today we've now made citizenship the vessel to hold all of these rights. But then that's where I find it interesting, because we, of course, create barriers and hurdles and obstacles to citizenship. And then my focus, of course, is on the denaturalization and denationalization. And this ties into a point Professor Cohen made. There's sort of an interesting, immigration is so anomalous in so many ways. And one of them is that there's no statute of limitations. So there's no statute of limitations to the wrong of crossing the border, the registry being the closest example of a statute of limitations, but it's now, I can't do the math, Elizabeth, you could, 50 years, something like that you have to have been in the US before you
since
could.
Since 1973.
Yeah, there you go. So that's I guess a statute of limitations, but a pretty long one, and to say the least. And then there's no statute of limitations to denaturalization. I mean, there is for criminal denaturalization, but not for civil. And the Trump administration, Jeff Sessions, cited that in public documents. He said we should go after people through civil denaturalization because there's no statute of limitations. And so that's where I think it's sort of interesting. We put all these rights onto citizenship, but then we start busily trying to bar citizenship, undermine citizenship. And we didn't used to think citizenship had to carry all that weight of all the rights being solely tied to the citizenship status. I think those two things are related.
And if I understand the question, I mean, I think part of the denial is punitive, right? There is nothing that suggests that citizens have kind of all of this knowledge or they're the only ones with skin in the game, right? There are indeed lots of people who are non-citizens for a variety of reasons, who've been here a long time, who pay taxes, who do all the things, right, that citizens do, yet don't have any of this formal recognition. Now, this is not to suggest, right, that there aren't other ways that non-citizens can participate. Right, political scientists, we talk about all the ways that people can be active citizens, but the vote is, I think, probably the ultimate sort of indicator of belonging. But if I'm trying to think about the whole question, I don't know that there are benefits to non-citizens in being denied the right to vote. I mean, I think it's another way to sort of demarcate the difference, right? To say, this is the us and you're one of the them. And you're, as a non-member, you don't get to participate in selecting the people who are making these regimes of enforcement that can make your life harder or better or worse or whatever. And so I don't know that there's an upside here, unless I'm misunderstanding the question, in which case I apologize to the questioner. But I don't think that this is not something that we've always had to do or that we've always done. It's a choice we make, and the choice we've made consistently is to make lives of immigrant people harder, not easier. And this is just one more way to do that. Also, because we are threatening people with federal law, that if you break this law, you're going to prison, right? If you participate in the voting system in any way, you can go to prison for this.
I just, if I may, would like to kind of take a slightly different view, which is just that it, by formally disaggregating or just reminding us that these rights can be disaggregated, we're also reminded that it would be possible to give non-citizens the opportunity to vote. Like, that is a thing we could do. Those things actually are disaggregated. Having legal nationality doesn't have to be the gateway to the franchise. And the work that Alan and Karthik have done reminds us that it would be possible, once reminded of this, for states to do the opposite and affirm a right to vote for non-citizens. I'm not saying that we exist in a climate where that's necessarily going to happen, but like, in addition to the disaggregation that the question implies for social and civil rights, there's also this possibility that other states may want to offer the franchise.
So I'll just briefly add a few things there. I mean, I think in our current context, these types of laws highlight the intersectionality between kind of communities of color who are citizens and ensuring that they aren't targeted for their voting rights, and then also kind of then scapegoating and having voter restrictions specific towards legal status. But there are other ways of thinking historically that, before World War II, there are many states that allowed immigrants to vote despite having citizenship or not. And voting goes beyond, there are many different types of elections. So voting on school board elections is something that is important if you're part of that community and your kids go to that school. And so there's lots of different pushes at the local level. and state laws have consequences for what voting rights are offered at the local level.
And I was going to say, just like in Maryland, for example, right, several localities allow non-citizens to participate in local elections. So it's not everywhere, but federal elections, no.
Well, and we have just a couple of minutes left, and I want to apologize in advance to those of you who asked questions that I was not able to get to. But I am really interested in this question that's for Amanda, which is, I'm sorry, Professor Frost, that your book is a historical tour of citizenship stripping in America. Does the threat of losing citizenship persist throughout history, or can the trajectory be altered by the passage of laws, for example, the 14th Amendment, Warnke Marx, civil rights, and or changing political conditions, Obama to Trump to Biden?
Yeah, so and Professor Carter, I want to have more conversations with you about this, because I think Dred Scott is just obviously a case that fascinates many of us, but to me, Chief Justice Taney in some ways understood the founding hypocrisy better than most. He just obviously, his view of how to reconcile, he said we cannot have a group of people, we can't have racialized slavery and then free Blacks as citizens. Like, that can't exist. And in some ways he was right. It's just the answer to that was, get rid of slavery. But to me, it's fascinating to see, to me, the struggle over citizenship throughout our history in so many different ways is primarily the struggle over the vision of the United States as a white nation or not. And I think that's a struggle. It goes up and down, but we have been in it for so long, and we can see it today as clearly as in the past, sadly. So to me, it's not about the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment was part of that struggle for sure, right? And you hear Charles Sumner, and he said, we're trying to get rid of, he said, caste, they used that word, and the oligarchy of skin. And they very clearly knew what they were trying to do with the 14th Amendment, which was to stop caste, like to stop in its tracks this idea that you'd have a group perpetually outside. And this is a point you all were making earlier, because I think it was in the Ming's Q&A with Hiroshi. It was by giving us birthright citizenship, we ensured that it would be only one generation that was on the outside and the next would be a part of us. But even the one generation on the outside is horrific, right? And that's what we're struggling with in these broader questions that Professor Chen asked in her book, and we're all dealing with today.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. And this is the part where I wish that we were in person so that we could linger around whatever conference room we were in and continue to gauge one another's work. I want to say thank you so much to the panelists for their incredible scholarship and for being a part of this conversation today. So thank you, all of you. And I hope that we are able to meet in person in the near future. All right. Take care. I'll hand it back to Suzette.
Thank you, everyone. I so appreciate your remarks and the robust conversation that followed afterwards. So we're going to have to keep going. So I'm going to ask our panelists to go ahead and leave this room. And we're going to be taking a 15-minute break. And so this is in Colorado time. This would sort of be a lunch panel that's coming up. I recognize that people have access all over the country. So this might not be your lunchtime, but we'll take a 15-minute break and we will return at 11:45 Mountain Time. And we are calling it just a lunch panel because of where we are. We encourage everybody to come back. The next panel is going to be really special. Stories of Immigrants is what we're going to be hearing. And so, as I mentioned earlier, Modus Theater last night, hearing the undocumented monologues was so powerful and so beautiful. So, please rejoin us in 15 minutes to hear some powerful stories and firsthand accounts. Just a quick reminder: we have the program is available for you if you'd like to go online and see what the rest of the day entails. You can go to cu.law/Rothgerber program. And we are encouraging people to, if you can come in and out of the day, that's fine. But if you can return at the end of the day and join us for what we're calling a virtual reception around 4 o'clock Mountain Time, where we'll be doing breakout rooms. And that's a place where you will have an opportunity to join a link that will enable you to go into breakout rooms and have smaller informal conversations, maybe about things you've heard today and things you could actually do to get involved, right? After a day of learning and thinking, what are some action steps you might want to take? So we'll be doing that in the virtual reception at the end of the day. And you can see the link is cu.law/Rothgerber reception, and you'll go there to join us. Thank you very much. And I look forward to seeing people back at 11:45 Mountain Time. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I know we still have some folks that are populating our panel, so we'll give them a little time to make that adjustment. I want to welcome folks back to the Rothgerber Conference. I don't know if you've got a chance to see the opening comments, the opening remarks, or the first panel, but we have had just a really sort of inspiring, dynamic, important conversation this morning. And so I just look forward to us continuing that dialogue. I'm going to remind folks, if you're just joining us now, great, we're really glad to have you. We sort of called this the lunch panel just because in Colorado it's kind of lunchtime, but I know there are people all over the country who are watching. So we're going to be taking a little, we might be taking a little lunch break, but we're thrilled to have our luncheon speakers today here to give us their firsthand accounts, right? Stories of immigrants. This is a particularly special panel, I think, because this is going to keep us really grounded and in reality. So I think it's so important that we don't have a conference which doesn't really kind of really take seriously and consider what are the implications, what do these policies feel like, look like, sound like. So this is really the foundation of the work that many of us are doing. So I'm thrilled to have our next set of panelists to join us. If you want more information about what's coming up next today, we have a program, a virtual program that's in the chat. We have a link that you can go to see what's coming. And we also have a virtual reception that will be happening later on today, about 4 o'clock Mountain Time, where we encourage people who are interested to join us in a conversation. There'll be a link where you actually get to join and you'll go into a breakout room. Maybe you want to do a deeper dive on a particular topic that's come up today. Maybe you want to learn more about sort of action steps that you can take based on some of the things you've learned. So we'll have that available to folks, and we hope that you take advantage of that if you can. So let me start off by just welcoming and thanking our luncheon panel. And I'd like to introduce the moderator of that panel today, my colleague, Professor Violeta Chapin. So welcome. Professor Chapin teaches the Criminal and Immigration Defense Clinic here at the University of Colorado Law School. She, along with her students, represent non-citizen clients who are navigating the state criminal court system as well as the federal immigration legal system. She defends undocumented students and others in the immigrant community as they navigate a variety of things. So things like DACA, temporary protected status, and other sort of immigrant-related programs. Before being a public defender, she worked on behalf of a death row inmate, working together with the attorneys at Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. So it really comes to the table with a lot of tremendous practical experience as well as intellectual heft. So we're really thrilled to have my colleague here, and I will let her take it from here. She can introduce the folks for this panel. I will remind you, actually, we are fortunate enough where people will be taking questions. So if you're part of our webinar audience, you can go ahead and post your questions in the Q&A. If you are watching live stream, you don't have that option, but we're excited to have you here anyway. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Professor Chapin.
Thank you, Suzette. I appreciate that so much, and I'm so happy to be part of this conference here today, and particularly happy to moderate this particular panel. Thank you to Professor Chen for writing her book and for bringing us all together here to talk about this really important topic, and of course to Professor Suzette Malveaux for leading us through this Rothgerber conference and bringing such important thoughts, ideas, and people together to discuss really relevant issues that are occurring today in our society. As Professor Malveaux told you, my name is Violeta Chapin. I'm a law professor here at Colorado Law, where I direct the Immigration Defense Clinic. Some of you may know that all law schools in America have legal clinics where students begin to get out of the classroom and into the courtroom. And so, as you heard, students in my clinic represent non-citizen clients in a wide variety of legal matters in both state and federal court. I love being a lawyer. I love that I've always been a free lawyer, and I love working with clients. In the last few years, our clients in the clinic have consisted primarily of immigrants. Most of you are likely aware that over the last 4 years, we have experienced a tremendous amount of hostility towards immigrants at the federal level, hostility that had a direct impact on the lives of clients. It is important to remember, however, that hostility towards immigrants is certainly not new in this country. A cursory look at the history of our immigration laws and policies, dating all the way back to 1882, when President Chester Arthur signed the infamous and flagrantly racist Chinese Exclusion Act, shows that America has long struggled with how we treat immigrants who arrive in this country. Today in America, we have 11 million undocumented immigrants who live among us, some of them for several decades, many of them parents of US citizen children. They live and often thrive here. But 11 million people are forced to live without legal citizenship, even if they participate in society in so many ways that I think all of us would agree are markers of a good citizen. I'm happy to share the screen this afternoon with 3 excellent citizens of our community, perhaps not in the legal sense yet, but excellent citizens in every other definition of the word. Professor Chen in her book provides us all with a much more expansive, accurate, and holistic way of considering the term citizenship. If we look at the way that immigrants participate politically, economically, and socially in American society, we see that the last piece of it, the legal piece, is on us and should necessarily derive from the ways that immigrants are already the best citizens that we can ask for. I'm here today with Salvador Hernandez, Alan Sanchez, and Shiyan Zhang. I've known Alan and Shiyan for several years, since they were both undergraduate students here at CU Boulder. And I met Salvador more recently through his voting advocacy work here in Colorado. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your stories with us. I'm going to ask each of you to briefly introduce yourselves. So if you can please tell us your name, what area of the world you're joining us from, and a little bit about what you do for work, that would be wonderful. We'll dive into immigration stories after that. So Shiyan, can we please start with you, and then Salvador, and then Alan?
Hi, can everyone hear me? Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Shiyan. I'm joining you from Denver, Colorado. Like Violeta said, I am a graduate of CU Boulder, and I am a DACA recipient. I am currently living and working in Denver. I am a treasury analyst for Aero Electronics. I basically manage all of our global banking, cash, and reporting analytics at the corporate level. So I'm dealing with global currencies all day long and different time zones and all that stuff, and banking relationships globally. So it's fun, it's a great exposure, and it just reminds me that, you know, we're just really connected in so many ways. And that's kind of the short thing. I want to keep it short.
Thank you, Cheyenne. Salvador, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, thank you, Violeta. Hi, everyone. My name is Salvador Hernandez. I'm a immigrant from Mexico. I immigrated to this country when I was 15 years old. I'm a former DACA recipient. I currently work as a Colorado state director with Mi Familia Vota. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. Our goal is to build political power to seek social and economic justice. We do this through different campaigns of civic participation. Some of you might know us from our work from doing a voter registration. We're in 6 different states, but we also work in other parts of the, you know, like what we call like civic participation or civic engagement. So we run other campaigns for citizenship. We run citizenship workshops. You know, we have partnered with CU Law School and DU Law School to help immigrants become citizens. And, you know, just overall, I'm happy to be here. And also I'm joining from Denver, Colorado. So good to see you all.
Thank you, Salvador. Alan.
Hey everybody, my name is Alan Sanchez. As Violeta mentioned, you know, me and Violeta go way back. Graduated from Boulder in aerospace engineering sciences in 2017, and then continued on to do my master's in aerospace engineering sciences in 2018. I was part of the CU Inspired Dreamers group with Shiyan all throughout my undergraduate time at CU. You know, working with Violeta, Dave, a lot of really great people during my time there, and you know, just made the experience a whole lot better. Right now, I'm a mechanical design engineer on the vehicle dynamics team at Tesla Motors. I'm in Palo Alto, California right now. There's a bunch of equations and stuff behind me. I'm just in one of the conference rooms here at the Tesla headquarters. Yeah, so now, you know, I've been working here in California for about 3 years after graduating from college, and you know, try to stay involved with the ERG here at Tesla and keep up with Violeta and kind of the Inspired Dreamer stuff as much as I can. So it was a great opportunity to be able to participate in this, and just really looking forward to sharing my experience.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you to all of you for sharing that information with us, and for being willing to participate here with us today. We're so happy that you can be part of this conference. So let's now dive into the immigration related part of this talk. I've learned over the years that immigrants arrive in the US for so many different reasons at so many different times, and that those particular stories or circumstances have such an impact on their experience here. So I'll ask each of you now to take a few minutes to share with us your family's immigration story, if you would. And with that, would you share maybe some thoughts on how your particular arrival in the United States shaped how you then participated, or maybe didn't participate in society, you know, at school, socially, or politically? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Alan, if we can start with you, please.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So just to begin, I'm a DACA recipient, like Cheyenne, and I came here actually when I was 8 months old. My brother and sister were, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 years old at the time. They're a little bit older than me. The way it happened is just, actually, I think I came with my mom and my siblings, probably driving in a car. I think that's how it happened. My dad had been kind of working various jobs in the sorry, one second. Had just been working various jobs in the country, just in back and forth, kind of doing a couple different manual labor type of tasks, and then just eventually, ended up saving enough money for
We might have lost Alan's connection for a bit. Let's see if we can get him back. We may move to another panelist just while he gets his internet going. Salvador, would you mind, could you jump in here and tell us a little bit about your story, and then we'll see if Alan can rejoin.
Yes, of course. Thank you. Yeah, so where to begin? I was 15 years old when I immigrated to the United States with my mom and siblings from Chihuahua, Mexico. We were actually really sort of like familiar with, the immigration system being in a border state in Mexico. So my mom was able to petition for us to get tourist visas, and that's how we came. We came to actually Las Vegas, and we just came out of economic necessity. My mom, had recently gotten divorced, and she had to move with her kids to, another country to provide for her kids. And that's how I ended up coming to this country when I was 15. And, back in those days, none of us spoke English, actually. So I had to learn English while I was in ESL classes in high school. Fortunately, I went to a very Latino school in Las Vegas called Rancho High School, where I had, a lot of support from my teachers and my, classmates. But I think the reason why I'm even in this panel today is because of the activism work that I started doing back when I was in high school. And, this came through a really engaged professor who he taught us, us undocumented immigrants in the school that, there were still, choices available for us, even though we couldn't apply for, federal student aid to go to college. There were other opportunities for us to succeed. So I ended up, going to community college in Las Vegas. But through the work in high school and in college, I sort of like got engaged in the political system through just activism. My first ever experience was in 2008 for the Democratic Caucus. I was still in high school. I was about to graduate, and a person from the Democratic Party came to a classroom to seek volunteers to help him with the caucus. So I didn't know anything about politics, but I knew that I could do something to have my voice heard. Because I was undocumented, couldn't vote. But I had a really great experience. I actually helped in a precinct caucus in North Las Vegas, and I helped translate with the very little English that I spoke at the time. I helped translate precinct caucus for 200 or 300 voters in that precinct. So that's kind of like how I got my first experience on activism, on sharing the power of my voice, even though I couldn't vote. And I just continued to keep engaged throughout my college, my high school and college years. And eventually I started volunteering just, with different various campaigns. I volunteered for the Rory Reid campaign when he was running for the governor of Nevada back in 2010. And I eventually found my way into Mi Familia Vota. And that's how I saw the power that, that we could have as immigrants. And, a lot of the work that I did with Mi Familia Vota when I started was registering people to vote through a campaign that we continue to do year round. And that's where I really found my passion was, registering other people to vote. And that's how I sort of eventually, became an activist, if you can call it that. But more so I realized the power that, being active in the community has, and the power that we have as immigrants.
Salvador, thank you for that. I'm wondering, you were older, right, when you arrived in the US. You were 15 years old. Alan shared with us that he was a baby when he arrived, right? And so I see a lot of variety amongst families as to whether or not and when the parents talk to their children about the fact that they're undocumented. Did your mother talk to you about your immigration status because you were older? Was it something that was a conversation you had in your family? And if so, how did she frame it? How did she talk about it?
Yeah, I mean, I was older, so I understood what was happening, and eventually, like, if it was up to me, like, I wouldn't have come to this country because I had my whole life in Mexico. I was going to school there. I was going to have a life there, but that's just the social circumstances and the economic circumstances. So I was very aware of my situation when I came to this country. But, that's not to say that I don't, like, understand like why a lot of parents, like, do the things that they do is because of their children, right? So every parent that I know is trying to provide for their kids, and that's exactly what my mom was doing. So I was fortunate enough to be able to support her and provide the little hope that I could, whether that was learning English and helping translate things for her. So I'm deeply grateful, that my mom made that choice, even though she came by herself with 4 kids to a country she didn't speak the language of, and she had an amazing disadvantage by being undocumented.
Thank you for that, Salvador. Alan, welcome back. Can we pick up where you left off?
Yes. Sorry, I just had a connection issue. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Yeah.
It's the world we live in Zoom. It's completely fine.
Yeah. So I was just saying that, yeah, basically, like, stark contrast to kind of what Salvador was saying, coming over at such a young age. And, I remember pretty much knowing about our status my whole life, really, because it was just something, my parents were very cautious people just about everything, really, just kind of like, even with our friends, they would say, make sure you don't, like, say anything about that, because it was a normal thing for me. But, even to our friends, didn't want to kind of share that kind of information because never really knew, I guess, who was, who could have, some less than favorable thoughts on our status, and just always kind of grown up like that. So always kind of, I don't want to say having a chip on your shoulder, but really just being, cautious and mindful of kind of your impact and your kind of your presence. So that's kind of how I grew up. And I think the other aspect of that is, I don't know, the other kind of aspect that I think, being DACA had on kind of my mentality growing up was just, I think we were afforded a lot less opportunities. Like, for example, when it came to applying for college, and I'm sure this is something, Shiyan and Salvador can both probably, relate to, is when it came time to apply for college, realizing that, you don't qualify for, I don't know, maybe when I was around my time, it was not qualifying for, maybe 80% of scholarships because, not meeting the citizenship requirements. And it was really strange. The challenging part was often the scholarship committees had no idea, what DACA was or why there was even these constraints. They really just had no idea. So a lot of it was just like really navigating on your own, and you couldn't really go for anyone for help. And that was kind of like, I think, a pretty common theme growing up, is just not really having, you couldn't really Google this type of stuff. Like nowadays, everyone just Googles everything. You couldn't really Google this, like the answers weren't out there. And that's why, when I think it was my sophomore year, kind of the Inspired Dreamers group with Dave Aragon and everyone kind of got together. That was really cool because we actually had some people to talk to. And it was very local too, CU Boulder specific. So yeah, so I guess like really common theme is just, not having anyone to really relate to for a long time, or anyone to, be able to ask questions to and get a solid answer. It was just a lot of, kind of vagueness or uncertainty, and that carried through for a really long time. Thankfully, when DACA came around and more and more visibility started being given to Dreamers and DACA, that changed things a little bit. And I think, certainly there's more opportunities at CU Boulder and, all across the country for DACA recipients, but it's still a constant limbo state, I think, for everyone in our position. Like limbo has always been the way I describe it. You're like, they say, ni de aquí, ni de allá, which is like, not from here or from there. You're just kind of in a limbo. So yeah, I would say that's probably one of the common themes of kind of upbringing.
Thank you for that, Alan. So much of what you said made me think about how it is that we all thought about the DACA program when it came out in 2012. If you'll remember, for those in the audience that know this or may not know so much about it, President Obama signed the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program into being in June of 2012. And what it did is it was the first program of its kind to target people like Alan and Salvador and Shiyan, who had arrived here when they were very young, and provide them with an immigration benefit that was, quite frankly, much less than they deserved, which would have been lawful status. But what it did is it asked them to declare themselves to the federal government. In exchange, if they met the eligibility requirements, they would be granted a 2-year deferral of their removal, a work permit, and a social security number, right? Which for many people, for everyone who applied for DACA, they didn't have a social security number prior to that. They didn't have work authorization prior to that, or any protection from deportation. Yet there were still hurdles, as Alan just pointed out. Alan, can you tell us a little bit, though, about how it is that receiving DACA, right, after years of being undocumented, changed the way that you participated, right, in society, even though there were still hurdles after getting DACA?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, it could go on. I could go on for a while, probably talking about how getting DACA changed kind of the way I participated. But I think probably the most relevant, because like you said, DACA, pretty much the main benefit is, allowing DACA recipients to work legally. The main way it kind of changed the way I participate is being able to kind of, go out and do the things that I really wanted to do. So I got DACA the end of my senior year in high school, or actually no, so it was the beginning of the second semester of my first year in college, and that pretty much changed everything, because it just felt like a kind of like a floodgate of opportunities had opened. There were so many research and work opportunities at CU Boulder, and I remember the first semester I was like, even just the first semester, like I was a pretty ambitious person, but I was like, oh, I can't do any of this. This is, really awful. But once I got DACA, I was able to participate and just kind of contribute. I wanted to learn everything I could and take all the opportunities that I could. And that really enabled that. So that's kind of like, the first way, and it just paved the way for me just being able to kind of pursue any opportunities that I wanted to, and just try my best to be involved in those ways. Yeah, without it, I mean, I just would have had so many less opportunities, been able to participate just in a lot less ways and contribute in a lot less ways. So, yeah.
Thanks, Alan. Shiyan, if we can now hear from you, I know your immigration story because I've known you so long now as well. But you have a fascinating immigration story, you and your family. So if you can share with us a little bit about that, and then also how it led you to participate. You've been so politically active as a DACA recipient. So if you could share some of that with us, please.
Okay. So I was born in Guangdong, and shortly after that, my parents moved to Botswana for a job opportunity. And that while there, my mom got pregnant. And at the time, China had a one-child policy. So we knew that we couldn't go back because we wanted to keep my little brother. And so, not having a lot of choices at the time, well, my parents have siblings here in the US, so we applied for visitors visas through them. And then a few months after my baby brother was born, we came to the US on those visitors visas. So, and then I have two younger siblings as well who were born here in Colorado. And so we really are a mixed status family. And because I am the oldest, I feel like that kind of naturally made me feel a lot of responsibility towards my family. And so that's part of the reason why I am so politically involved, and I do so much of my advocacy work on immigration reform. But I think it really started when my parents pursued an asylum case for us in middle school. And I remember showing up, you know, I didn't actually understand what was going on because the case was just against my parents. It didn't even mention what they were going to do with the 4 kids. But I remember showing up on the steps of the Colorado Supreme Court and thinking, and I'm just this little girl, and I'm like, you know, we're going to win this case, and, you know, it's going to be just great. And, you know, my parents will stop fighting about paying the lawyers and the stress of this case that had been going on for years and years. Ultimately, we lost that asylum case, and things really went downhill for my family from there. My parents ended up divorcing. We were just struggling with that as keeping the family together, and then financially, the fees that we paid for the lawyers were a burden. And so then time went by, and then DACA was passed, and I remember just sitting in my living room floor the summer it passed and just gathering all of my school records that I could, not even realizing that I should probably get like a lawyer's help. I didn't trust lawyers by this time. And so I applied for DACA on my own, and I actually got approved. Like, they actually didn't ask for any additional stuff. I did it right my first time, so that was a miracle. And ever since then, just it kind of slowly built from that losing that asylum case to getting DACA on my own, and then growing up in Grand Junction, which is a very not diverse environment, just kind of naturally made me have to look for resources for myself. And I was the first one to have to do this because I'm the oldest. So it just kind of, all of the work and responsibility I took on was kind of out of necessity.
Thank you, Shiyan. You know, you speak so honestly and truly about the stress of the immigration system and what it does to families and to children. And I'm sorry too that you had a bad experience with lawyers. You're certainly not the only one. And it wasn't a miracle that you got DACA, it's just that you're that good. You were able to put all of that together yourself. But knowing how sort of traumatizing the immigration system has been already for you and your family, when you decided to become politically active, did anyone try to talk you out of it? Did your parents try to talk you out of it? Did any of your friends or peers try to talk you out of it because of what you'd already been through?
No, no one tried to talk me out of it. It was more just like the kind of general fear that was all around. Like, for example, I remember I had just last summer organized a Inspired Dreamers reunion, and you know, I didn't know that this was happening, but apparently there was some security issues, and people could be meetings could be breached, and you know, you're having a meeting with people who are not, I guess, out that they're about their status. And you know, we talk about our families a lot too. So someone had warned me, hey, maybe we shouldn't do this on Zoom or something because of the potential risk that, I don't know, like ICE was infiltrating meetings or something like that. I don't remember exactly, but like that made me scared. I was like, oh, maybe we shouldn't even be holding this reunion, you know, like reunions happen all the time. And but that was just something that, another thing that we had to think about before we could do something as simple as a Zoom meeting together. So I wouldn't say any specific person has, advised me not to be politically involved. And, if you actually look me up, I've been on the New York Times and I've been on national news in DC and on Denver local news. And so, of course, I have thought about, like, if someone just looked me up, if they had any ill intent, they could use this as a weapon against me and my family. So that's actually come across my worries with all the political activism I've been doing. So, but that hasn't stopped me.
Good for you, girl. So I have sort of 3 specific questions, or one for each of you, that I'm gonna ask you. And then I think we will have some time for audience questions after that. So I'm gonna start with Salvador. Despite not having legal status in the US for so many years, now you are a lawful permanent resident on your way to citizenship. You've participated in many ways that all of us could agree make people good citizens in any society. Sort of reaching back to when you were still undocumented and in high school, Salvador, you became politically active, as you've shared with us, and have since been deeply engaged in encouraging people who can vote, to make informed decisions about who they vote for. If you could tell us a little bit about why you focus on the right to vote, even when all of these years you personally have not been able to vote legally yet in America.
Yeah, thanks for that question. And yeah, I guess this goes back to those former years in high school. And, this was back in 2006, 2008, around that time, that's when I became so like aware of that, the DREAM Act was a thing, this proposal of a law that now we know, I'm pretty sure everyone knows what the DREAM Act is and it knows about dreamers, but back then it was like, I guess like a light at the end of the tunnel for me, where I saw that, that something could be done about, my immigrant status and the immigration status of a lot of my classmates. And when I've learned about, what it would take for such a law to pass in Congress, then that's when I became sort of like an activist, encouraging my fellow classmates to, the ones that could participate, the ones that are citizens, I talked to them, and that's where I saw the power, because a lot of my classmates were not voting at the time, and this was a shock for me. It was like, why, why are they not voting? Because they have the right to, but they're not, and that's sort of like how I started seeing that I could have an influence in the political system through my voice, just by sharing my story, talking to, starting with people that I knew, classmates, even some of my cousins. So, and that's sort of like how I got started. I got interested into volunteering, and that was another way for me to not only encourage people to vote, but to be active in many other ways. Call your congressman, your congresswoman, raise up your voice, show up to other political events or rallies, and all of those other things, the million things that you could do even if you're not a citizen. And that's sort of like why I kind of like stuck with this line of work at Mi Familia Vota. I've been here for 6 years. Started back in 2013 in Las Vegas, and that work of activism and encouraging people to participate and vote and know why, and I've seen, the power that that we have as a community if we participate, if we raise up our voices. And, I always like to say that we we didn't just get DACA just because of the good kindness of, President Obama, although, he was a great president in many aspects. It had to be because, we put pressure on his administration and and people in Congress through many years. It's a culmination of many years, and that's why DACA happened. And you ask Cheyenne, like about when you got DACA, I was like, how did that change your life? I remember when I learned about DACA, like 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 when people say like, oh, do you know where you were when 9/11 happened? Like, I remember where I was when the announcement of DACA was made, and I remember the day I got my work permit in the mail. Like, I just started sobbing in tears, and that really changed my life. Like, it put another different perspective in terms of like what I was able to do and like how comfortable I felt with activism, because I've always carried that that worriedness, or that just like uncertainty about showing up to an event where we're gonna protest the office of ex-congressman, and we're gonna show up to his office with signs. Maybe the police are gonna be there, they're gonna kick us out. Are they going to arrest us? Now, if we're arrested, am I referred to immigration and customs enforcement? Does ICE become involved? So, even driving, like if you get stopped, that's like the first thing that happens, through, at least through my mind as an immigrant, is like, am I gonna get deported? But having that DACA really empowered me to, do more and take an extra step into and being an activist. And, I've fallen in love with that ever since. I was able to do it as a job. And, that's how I ended up here. And that's why I'm ultimately in this conference, because I've gotten to know a lot of people through the activism work that I do. And yeah, I love what I do.
Thank you. I so appreciate your courage. And I remember in 2012 and before that, when the DREAM Act was coming up for passage in Congress, and so many undocumented young people wanted to go and sit outside of Congress people's offices and do sit-ins and be really sort of out and proud about being undocumented. And so many of the older set, right, including myself, were like, be very careful. Like, I'm so concerned that maybe they're gonna get you. And then if you're in removal proceedings, and it harkened back a lot to what happened during the civil rights struggle, right? When a lot of the younger folks were like, we're gonna go sit in at the lunch counter and we're going to demand for our rights. And so many of the older folks were like, wait, and don't do this sort of active activism that could put you in harm's way. Yet young people like yourselves were unafraid anyway and did it. And that's really what I believe has pushed the envelope, like why we've gotten as far as we have, because there have been people who have been fearless despite having everything to lose, going because it's the right thing to do. Alan, I was gonna come to you now and ask you to share with us something that you and I talked about a few years ago, because we experienced it when you were here. You graduated from the School of Engineering here at CU Boulder a few years ago. And while you were here, you had an experience while you were a summer. It was over the summer where you got an internship, where you learned that despite all of your hard work, that you would not be able to work at the internship and potentially no longer in space, which is where you wanted to work. Can you share with us a little bit about that experience? And while it was difficult, I know it perhaps allowed you to be where you are now, doing so well and thriving at Tesla. Can you share that with us, Alan?
Yeah. So like you said, I was always interested in aerospace engineering and just space science and space engineering. That's why I studied aerospace engineering at CU Boulder. And through my freshman, sophomore year, and I think it was freshman, sophomore, junior year, I was always just doing all of the work that I could do, which was kind of gaining my skills, but it was sort of aerospace related, but not really, because most aerospace work is subject to ITAR regulations, which is International Traffic in Arms Regulations, which is just Cold War era kind of rules that make it really difficult for non-citizens or non-green card holders to work in aerospace. So just throughout like my whole undergraduate career, I was working in what I could. It was sort of related, but not exactly what I wanted to do. Finally, for the summer between junior and senior year, I had managed to, apply for a systems engineering role at a major aerospace contractor. And, I, just submitted my paperwork and applied, and it was great. I got a 7-month internship, and I was really excited because it was in, working on actual space systems. So this was in Madison, Wisconsin. And then I get there, I'm working there for a couple of weeks. I think it was maybe 5 weeks. And then it was great. It was pretty cool work. I liked it a lot. And then suddenly I get called into the main office just for I just say, oh, we need you in the main office. And I was like, oh, this is kind of weird. But they call me into the main office, and basically they tell me that there's been an issue, and that someone made a clerical mistake, and that I'm not supposed to be working on the projects that I'm supposed to be working on. So kind of like go grab my backpack and escorted me out of the premise right at that moment, and just said, we'll call you back in when we when we can. And a couple of days after that, they call me back in and just say like, oh yeah, actually they interviewed me and asked me a whole bunch of crazy questions like, have you talked to anyone about the work you've been doing? Do you know people who are non-citizens? And I was like, yeah, like my grandma. Like, have you told your grandma about like the rockets you're working on? I was like, no, she's not interested. But yeah, basically they had to let me go. It was supposed to be a 7th-month internship, and they let me go and gave me, I think, like $2,000. They're like, here's your compensation, go on your way. And I was in the middle of Wisconsin. Like I had kind of arranged housing for the rest of the summer, and it was just a really gloomy couple of days after that, trying to figure out what to do, because here I was like having waited so long for an opportunity where I could actually work on space stuff, and finally I found it, and I was really like, wow, this is awesome. I couldn't even believe it, and it just came crashing down. I was like, oh, this is too good to be true. And at that point, I think I was a very persistent individual, and I was like, regardless of these ITAR regulations, I'll make my way in somehow. And at that point, I basically decided this is not going to happen. I'm not going to in the near future, I'm not going to be able to kind of supersede those rules, and I need to kind of reconsider the path that I'm going on. So in that moment is when I decided to start looking in other fields, and I was really interested in SpaceX. Like that's the #1 company I wanted to work for, but obviously I couldn't. So I started just like looking into other fields, and that's how I basically at that point, that's when I started applying for other fields, and I applied for an internship at Tesla at the time. And I heard back from the recruiter, and I ended up getting an internship at Tesla, and I did that for an entire year. So now I've been here full time for 2 years, so just 3 years at Tesla now. So like you said, it was really probably one of the lowest moments in my life, just because it was a high peak and then brought down abruptly. But I'm grateful for that, because it got me to where I am today, and it just kind of made me, again, another just example of we're always having to be very open-minded as DACA recipients. You always just have to adapt and be very flexible. And this was a kind of extreme example of that. But without that, unfortunate incident, I wouldn't have, gotten the opportunity that I did. So it all worked out in the end.
It did, in large part because you managed to make it work out in the end. And that's an important thing. I think the thing that pains me the most is that it happened at all, and you had to navigate yet another hurdle. One of the things that I have learned since being here at CU Boulder, and collaborating with David Aragon over in the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Community Engagement, is that we have undocumented students here at CU Boulder, many of whom are DACA recipients. Not all of them are. And I've met most of them, if not all of them, over the last few years. And because of their particular situation of not having legal citizenship in the United States, yet being here nonetheless and participating in so many ways, that they hit these hurdles that US citizens never even have to think about. And that requires them, as you said, Alan, to be open-minded, right? To be nimble and to be able to pivot and to be resilient. And those are traits and characteristics which all of us should have, and many of us don't have and wish we did. And so to the extent that there's a silver lining to any of this, I suppose that could be one of them, right? Which is that because of these unnecessary hurdles and walls that the United States legal system throws up, many of which are random and don't make any sort of logical sense. So many immigrants in America, whether they're DACA recipients, whether they're completely undocumented, whether they're residents, whether they are asylum seekers, all sort of stripes, colors, and kinds of immigrants have to learn to navigate a very confusing and frightening system, and that causes them to have to figure out how to make it happen, which is exactly what Alan did. Thank you for sharing that story, Alan. Shiyan, as you shared with us, you are the oldest of 4 children, and your 2 youngest siblings are both US citizens since they were born right here in Grand Junction, Colorado. Can you talk with us a little bit more about how being part of a mixed status family and the oldest sibling that all of the younger ones look up to, how has that experience informed your decision-making? And what I mean by that is, how have you navigated decisions about whether to talk to your younger siblings about the legal immigration situation you each have? How has this affected how you make decisions about maybe where you will work, where you live, and even begin your own adult life?
Yes, I think every decision I've made has been influenced by my family. For example, when I left Grand Junction to go to college in Boulder, I mean, it's a 4-hour drive. It'd be an 8-hour trip back and forth. So I couldn't just go on the weekends. So I felt really guilty for leaving them, even though I knew that going to college was what I needed to do, not just for myself, but for all of us. And it was really hard to try to focus on school, all the pressures of school, and then still, feel like that pull that my family had in Grand Junction. And then it only got worse. Like after I graduated, I debated going back to Grand Junction just to be close, but that would have meant giving up on my job prospects here. So it's been really hard trying to balance chasing my dreams and the responsibility I have towards my family. And a lot of the advocacy work I do is actually more for my family than myself, because I cannot fathom the idea of leaving my siblings behind if something were to happen to my parents or me. So, on the one hand, I'm trying to protect them from as much as possible, but then it hinders their ability to really grasp what it means to have undocumented parents and older siblings. And it's really hard to explain to them because they just can't make that connection because they're US citizens. And I don't think they ever will because they are US citizens. But to Alan's point, kind of to touch on what Alan had shared and what you kind of commented on is that yes, these obstacles and hurdles make us resilient. And yes, we are in fight mode, but I don't think we talk enough about the trauma afterwards and the trauma of experiencing these laws or non-formal laws even. For example, I think I really had to share, and I think my siblings started really understanding what it meant to be undocumented when my mom was in ICE custody last year. And just always wondering, when is she coming out? And then, you know, just not knowing. I think that's when they finally started to understand. And now that they're getting older, they're starting to understand what it means when, oh, mom is in ICE detention center. And so it's kind of like they've had to also learn about being a mixed status family as things happen to us.
Thank you for that, Cheyenne. You're so right. And the way that you just ended what you said, which is the experience of so many immigrants in America, which is unfortunately waiting for things to happen to us, right? Because the federal immigration system plows on, right, without any real consideration for families and their feelings and all of the sort of peace that just knowing what's going to happen to you brings to all of us, and that too many of us take for granted. What you said reminded me of a young woman who just published a book called Undocumented Americans by Carla Villavicencio. And she's been writing for many years. She was a DACA recipient, and she's been writing for the New York Times and for the New Yorker about her experience. And she talks very frankly about the emotional toll and the anxiety for immigrants of being undocumented and what that means for both children and family members. Last night, I don't know if all of you were able to join us, but maybe some people on the panel were, there was a presentation by Modus Theater featuring two undocumented young men who shared their stories, and another undocumented community member who shared their story that was read by Judge Mimi Sankov. But one of the ones who shared his own story, he told a very powerful story about, he like yourself, Cheyenne, is a member of a mixed status family. He's undocumented. He has an older undocumented sibling, an older sibling, but his younger sister is a citizen of the United States. And he described very powerfully how frightening it was for her, for his 8-year-old sister to think that perhaps her undocumented family, because she was the only citizen in a family that was entirely undocumented, how traumatizing it was for that US citizen, right? His US citizen sister, to think about losing her family. And I'm wondering if you've been able to have those conversations with your US citizen siblings, Cheyenne, and how is it that you deal with that burden and both sort of the emotional toll of having that conversation?
I think, again, it's like when you're in action, as things are happening, you discuss it, but you're actually just kind of stating it as a matter of fact. Like, mom's in ICE because we don't have papers, and you two are protected because you're US citizens. And if mom is deported, well, you two can go visit her, but the older siblings can't. And we were having these discussions about, like, possibly, them spending the summers if mom were to be deported with mom, or, separating us and having the siblings go to where mom is. And it's just trying to figure out the logistics of it all, just kind of didn't allow us to process what happened and what was happening and what this meant for all of us. So actually, we have yet to even have that conversation. I don't know how I processed it, because I remember while my mom was in ICE custody and I'm working full time, I still had to answer her calls. And her sister ended up being able to hire her a lawyer to get her out, because she was there for over 6 months and she was sick and COVID was really bad. This was when COVID was actually really bad. And she was in California at the time. And I remember after work, I had to scan all these documents from the asylum case, and there were like thousands of papers, and I had to use the work computer because that was a bigger scanner than what I could use at home. And so after work, I spent hours scanning paper And so again, when you're in action mode, you don't have time to think about what this is doing to me. And for my siblings, I don't know how they processed it. I imagine that it was really hard, but it just kind of, during the time, it was just like matter of fact, mom's in ICE custody. We can only talk to her when she calls us, or when we set up these appointments to video conference. Maybe she'll come out next month. Maybe she'll come out the next month. Maybe, it was just, you just didn't have an answer. It was uncertain. And so they've probably just had to learn how to pivot as well.
Thank you for sharing that with us, Cheyenne. I am going to invite the audience to submit questions through the Q&A if they would like. I'll continue because I would like to hear a little bit from Salvador about how your immigration status has changed, and you now are a resident because you received what we call a U visa, which is one of the very few ways that people can lawfully become residents of the United States. Unfortunately, the U visa requires you to be a victim of a crime, right, which is terrible, and then to cooperate with law enforcement in prosecution of that crime. And I certainly don't want anyone to ever be a victim of a crime, but you, Salvador, were unfortunately a victim of a crime, but it did allow you to get this U visa. Can you share with us a little bit about that experience, and then how it changed, again, becoming a resident, how it changed how you participated in our society?
Yeah, definitely. So that's a very traumatic experience, to say the least. Throughout this, I've been in this country since 2005, and I've been, undocumented. Then, I was able to apply for DACA, then eventually U visa, and now I'm a legal permanent resident. But yeah, I feel like, unfortunately, there are not many paths for undocumented folks or even dreamers to adjust their status, and that has to do with the current immigration system. But I had to go through the most horrible thing that could happen to a person, which is being the victim of a crime. And these U visas, just to put it in context, they're, like you said, given, or not given, but you have to apply for it, right? If you were a victim of a certain crime that cost you, physical or emotional pain, and there's this whole process where you have to, ask, to cooperate with the police in prosecuting the crime which you were a victim of. In which my case, I was 19 years old, and I was assaulted on the streets in Las Vegas, and I was shot 5 times. So I almost, lost my life as a consequence of, gun violence. But that, allowed me to later apply for this, this U visa, which it didn't come like as a very natural progression in my immigrant life, because I didn't know about this such thing when I was 19 years old. I was my first semester in community college, being an undocumented immigrant. And it wasn't until like later that I found out, like 2 or 3 or 4 years later, when I found out about this, this U visa, or when I was encouraged to apply. And because of that, as a derivative of U visa, I've got a petition for my younger sibling who was, under 18 at the time. So he could have adjusted his status as a result of that. But, just because of the lack of information that I had, being a very young person in this country, I didn't apply sooner, and therefore he wasn't able to adjust his status with me as a result of that. But, that really taught me the importance of, I guess, like, first being informed about the immigration system, not only about the immigration system, but the criminal justice system, and, how we interact with the criminal justice system in this country. And secondly, like, it's, just like opened my eyes to, like, the just the very few paths that a person has to adjust their status. And if it wasn't for that horrible, crime that I was a victim of, you know, like I don't know where I would be, you know, I would probably just be like renewing my DACA permit, my work permit every 2 years, like so many of my colleagues do. Like my brother still has DACA, he still renews it every 2 years. And like I said, you know, I will still be in that situation. But because of that, you know, I was able to become then a legal permanent resident after having that U visa, which is just a work permit. It doesn't mean you can leave the country. It does grant you, you know, a social security number, which I already had because of DACA, but it just extended my work permit for another 4 years. After 3 years, I was able to apply for a legal permanent residency. And in 2019 is when I got that approved and really took a really long breath. And that's when I really felt, you know, all of this, you know, this shadow like being lifted from me. And, you know, I truly felt like I was free. Like after, you know, coming, you know, after not being able to travel to my, you know, my country, Mexico, after 12 years and not seeing my older brother who still lives there, you know, I was able to, you know, reunite with, you know, my family. You know, I met, you know, my nieces and nephews that I've never met, only through video because I couldn't travel. So that was a really emotional and you know, just like family reunification moment that, you know, I wish, you know, that a lot of, you know, of our elected officials could see that it's, you know, that the immigrant community is suffering because, you know, they can't see their families. And you know, like it's that all like sort of like has, you know, kept me in this movement of immigrant justice activism, you know, civic engagement. Currently there's a bill in the Colorado legislature to you know, to make it a process or standardize a process in which law enforcement agencies sign onto U visa certifications, which is the most important document that you need when you're going to apply for a U visa, is that the police has to certify that you have been cooperative and that you're basically qualify for this U visa. And as we know, like many, you know, police departments and county sheriff's offices are really reluctant to sign on into those U visas, therefore like holding the future of immigrants literally in their hands. Like they have this power of signing on to those U visa certifications. And a lot of people are struggling with that, you know, because of, you know, the way that our law enforcement system works. So, you know, that bill would change, you know, the way in which law enforcement, you know, and just any police department interacts with those types of requests. And it would streamline the way in which they respond to them, therefore making it better, allowing other immigrants who are, you know, victims of crimes to be able to ask for this immigration benefit that could change their life. It did in my case. And, you know, although really I wish I didn't have to be through that horrible experience of being shot. I'm still sort of like grateful, and I see the bright side of things of like, yeah, I almost died, but looking in retrospect, that was a blessing in disguise, if you could call it that, which is, you know, just like, unfortunately, the situation that a lot of people have to go through.
Thank you, Salvador. Yeah, that story is again just so difficult and hard to see how it is that our immigration system requires something really awful to happen to someone at times in order for them to jump on a lawful path. But I appreciate you also pointing out legislation that could change lives, that could improve things as we go forward. We do have a question from the participants for each of you, and I guess if Alan and Shiyan want to start off with any thoughts on this. As we look to the future, we obviously have a new president, thank goodness, and there are some promising pieces of legislation pending in the United States Congress as well. What are your thoughts about what you envision in the future as a more fair immigration system? So Alan, if you have thoughts about that, or Cheyenne. Or Salvador.
Yeah, I mean, I can talk a little bit about it. So yeah, like you said, the legislation that's, currently, I guess since, the year 2000, there's been different versions of the DREAM Act that have been, made it, through various through various levels, but have never made it all the way to kind of, benefit us. But I think, at least to start, for people like myself and Cheyenne, I think it's difficult to come up with good reasons to, kind of keep us in this limbo state. Like we're obviously, all of us are super grateful for DACA, and like I said, the opportunities that, this has afforded us, but it is really quite strange that we've been in this limbo state for like 9 years now. So I think, some immediate legislation to kind of expand the scope of DACA and, make a pathway to citizenship for DACA recipients is obviously the most, it is the most obvious, short-term response. Yeah, I think that's kind of all I would say right now. I don't, know kind of legal expert, so I don't want to, like, I think I would, be a question better suited for maybe like Violeta or Salvador.
I have so many thoughts about that. But yes, I'd love to hear. Thank you, Alan, for sharing that. Cheyenne and Salvador, any closing thoughts? We have about 5 more minutes left.
For me, I think if we're talking about the future, I look at maybe not the near future, but I would envision a future without borders, because to even say that having an immigration system is fair when it's rooted in so much is rooted in racism, and it goes back to colonialism. It's not a coincidence that a lot of the countries that were colonizers, now their passports have access to more than 25% of the world's countries. So you can freely move if you are a holder of an American passport, but if you are a holder of a passport like from a Sri Lankan passport, you might have access to maybe 25% of the world's countries. And so it's not a coincidence that that predominantly white countries are able to just have more access and more freedom. So that's really what it is the freedom to move and the freedom to do what you want to do. And from the beginning of time, humans have been moving. So I don't think you can actually, I think that's an oxymoron to say that an immigration system could be fair that limits and allows certain people in, but then limits other people from entering a country. So that's my opinion on that.
Thank you, Cheyenne. So appreciated. In our last 3 minutes, Salvador.
Yeah, just real quick, I do envision a more fair immigration system as one that where policies that are implemented are rooted on decriminalizing immigrants. We have such a history of criminalizing immigrants in this country, and and in punishing immigrants for for doing what's best for their families. We have to also remember that most of the folks who come undocumented is mostly out of necessity. They're seeking for a better life, and and I would say like also like creating a more fair immigration system. It also would mean like keeping a family reunification as a goal. We have such a strong bond or family values that that keeping families together, allowing for folks to like Cheyenne said, freely travel. It's like what a lot of people are searching for, and just like giving immigrants the opportunity to earn, the immigration status that we so seek, like us as dreamers, I call myself a former dreamer, have proven again, time and again, that we're worthy, of US citizenship. We go through a background check, we've shown that we're, good, quote unquote, like citizens of this country. We go through a criminal check every 2 years. So we are sort of like the low hanging fruit when it comes to like who deserves a immigrant status in this country. And that's not to say, that we should only focus on dreamers. Our parents are also, immigrants, and, we need to ultimately seek an immigration reform for all 12 undocumented immigrants who live in this country. They also deserve, the opportunities. And I personally, would want to see, policies that would rather, not, infringe on, other immigrants or at the cost of other immigrants. Like, yeah, like we're going to give you citizenship, but we're going to deport your parents. Like, I am not, for anything like that, or militarizing the border, or, enacting this horrible, policies at the border of family separation. So, we're not, I'm not, like up to like throwing all of the other, immigrants under the bus and say like, yeah, like we want to have a citizenship, but at what cost?
Thank you, Salvador. I so agree with that. We need a humane system that appreciates all of the people that live in our communities and contribute so much. I want to thank all three of you so very much for being with us today, for sharing your stories, and for allowing us to see into a window of life that so many of us don't get to see all the time and personally experienced, but very much can empathize with. So thank you so much, all three of you, for joining us here today. Suzette, did you have any final thoughts?
I just wanted to sort of echo what you're saying. I'm so grateful. I knew this panel was going to be a treasure. I just, so special. I appreciate your courage and your leadership. And I'm reminded how important it is. The young people, right, are at the forefront of so many of the positive changes that we see in society. So thank you for being so brave and vulnerable with us today, and helping us to really understand what this is like experientially, rather than just sort of, there's going to be a lot of conversation and a lot of articles and books and things like that. And that's helpful and important. But I also think it's really important to stay grounded in the lived experiences of people. So thank you for your courage and your excellent ideas. Thank you, Professor Chapin. I appreciate it. I'm going to ask our panelists to go ahead and leave the Zoom room at this time. And we are going to take a 15-minute break. So we will be resuming the program at 1:15 Mountain Time. And we'll be opening up to panel number 2, which is citizenship, integration, and belonging. Just a note for folks who are coming in and out, feel free to jump in and out of this conference as you can. Just use the link that you have. And we have a program. That link to the program is in your chat. We also have a link in the chat that will encourage you to come and join us if you want to, in fact, be in conversation. At the end of the day, we will be doing a virtual reception. So at this point, we're going to take a quick 15-minute break, and we'll resume at 1:15 Mountain Time for panel number 2, citizenship, integration, and belonging.